Ghost Coup. An action, adventure shadowboxer thriller. Chapter 1. Get him up. The voice was a low grunt, thick with a language Brill didn't speak but understood perfectly. It was the universal language of men with guns talking about a man without them. The zip tie bit deeper into Brill's wrists as a hand grabbed the back of his collar, hauling him from the soft leather seat of the Gulf Stream. He didn't resist. He let his body go with the motion, a dead weight making the guard do all the work. The guard grunted again, this time with effort. The heat hit him first. It wasn't just heat, it was a physical presence, a wet, heavy blanket of air that smelled of jet fuel, damp earth, and something else, something vaguely sweet and rotten like overripe fruit. He stood blinking on the top step of the jet's ramp, the African sun a white-hot hammer in a bleached-out sky. The airstrip was a long, cracked ribbon of blacktop cut into a landscape of vibrant, aggressive green. A handful of old Soviet-era Hind helicopters sat silently under camouflage netting, looking like giant sleeping insects. 24 soldiers in mismatched fatigues stood in a loose formation near a line of armored vehicles, their rifles held with a lazy familiarity. They were watching him. The prize. The ghost who had been caught. Colonel Jallo was waiting for him at the bottom of the ramp. He wore a crisp, khaki military uniform now, adorned with medals a Koro had probably invented for him. He was smiling, a wide, genuine smile of pure, malevolent satisfaction. "Welcome to Kando," Jallo said in his thick, precise English. "The president sends his regrets that he could not be here to greet you personally. He is a very busy man." Brill didn't say anything. He just looked at Jallo, his eyes taking in the man's posture, the way his hand rested near the butt of his holstered pistol, the sweat beading on his upper lip. "He asked me to convey a message, however," Jallo continued, enjoying his moment. "He wants you to know that your accommodations are ready. The finest our country has to offer." Two of Jallo's men, big men from the Presidential Guard, grabbed Brill's arms and shoved him down the ramp. His boots hit the tarmac, the heat rising from it in shimmering waves. They pushed him toward a waiting vehicle, a BTR-80, a hulking 8-wheeled Soviet-era armored personnel carrier painted in jungle camouflage. Its engine was idling with a low, throaty rumble. They threw him into the back. The rear hatch slammed shut with a clang of heavy steel, plunging him into a dark, suffocating box that smelled of diesel fumes, sweat, and old fear. He landed hard on the metal floor. The two guards climbed in after him, taking seats on the narrow benches that ran along the sides. The vehicle lurched into motion. Brill sat on the floor, his back against the vibrating hull. He didn't try to get up. He just sat, listening, feeling. He felt the vehicle turn, rumble across the tarmac, and then hit a rougher road. He could hear the shouts of the soldiers outside, the sounds of the city beginning to filter in. The two guards ignored him. They started talking in their native tongue, their voices relaxed now that the prisoner was secure. One of them took out a pack of cheap cigarettes and lit one, the flare of the match briefly illuminating their faces. They were young, their faces still holding a hint of the village, but their eyes were hard. Brill didn't understand their words, but he understood their tone. They were talking about women, about money. They were talking about the bounty a Koro had placed on his head. They were talking about what they would do with their share. He closed his eyes. Not to rest. To map the journey. He counted the turns. Left. Right. A long straightaway. Another right. He felt the vehicle slow, then stop. He heard the chaotic sounds of a city market, shouting vendors, the bleating of goats, the incessant buzz of motorbikes. He could smell spices and charcoal fires and open sewers. This was the capital. A Koro's capital. A thin veneer of military power laid over a deep, sprawling poverty. The journey continued for what felt like an hour. The sounds of the city faded, replaced by the sounds of the jungle. The road became rougher, the BTR bouncing and swaying. The air in the steel box grew hotter, staler. The guards fell silent. Finally, the vehicle slowed and stopped. The engine idled for a moment, then cut out. The silence was jarring. Brill could hear a new sound now. The sound of the sea. The rhythmic crash of waves against a shore. And another sound. The cry of gulls. The rear hatch opened, blinding him with a square of brilliant, painful sunlight. "Out," one of the guards grunted. Brill pushed himself to his feet, his muscles stiff. He stepped out of the BTR and onto a stone pier. The air was thick with the smell of salt and rotting seaweed. They were on the coast. A small, rusty patrol boat was tied to the pier, its engine chugging out a plume of black smoke. And out on the water, maybe a mile offshore, was an island. It wasn't a tropical paradise. It was a jagged black rock rising from the sea, its sides sheer cliffs. Perched on top of it, like a vulture on a corpse, was a fortress. It was old, colonial, built from dark volcanic stone that seemed to absorb the light. Its walls were high, its watchtowers crumbling. It was a place built for forgetting people. The Black Citadel, Jallo said. He had followed them, in another vehicle. He stood on the pier, a silhouette against the bright sea. Built by the Portuguese in the 16th century, to hold slaves before they were shipped to the New World. Refurbished by the British in the 19th, to hold political prisoners. And perfected by me last year. He smiled, his terrible smile. It is very secure. They pushed Brill toward the boat. He walked down the pier, his eyes on the fortress. He was studying the walls, the watchtowers, the way the waves crashed against the base of the cliffs. He was looking for a way out before he was even in. The boat ride was short and rough. The patrol boat pitched and rolled in the swells. The spray was warm on Brill's face. The citadel grew larger, more menacing with every wave. He could see the details now. The rust stains bleeding down the stone walls from the iron bars on the windows. The razor wire coiled along the top. The single, massive iron gate that faced the sea. The boat docked at a small, crude pier at the base of the cliff. A set of steep stone steps, slick with green slime, had been carved into the rock face leading up to the gate. Jallo's men dragged him from the boat and up the stairs. The iron gate groaned open as they approached. They stepped inside. The gate slammed shut behind them with a sound of utter finality, a sound that echoed off the stone walls of the courtyard. The air inside was still and dead, the sun blocked by the high walls. The place smelled of despair. Jallo walked up to Brill, his face inches away. "You killed the president's brother," he said, his voice a low, vicious whisper. "The president is a man of justice. He believes in an eye for an eye. But he is also a patient man. He will not grant you a quick death. You will sit in this place. You will rot. The world will forget you ever existed. Your ghost will die here, in this citadel." He nodded to his men. They grabbed Brill and began to drag him across the courtyard, toward a low stone building with a single iron-banded door. Chapter 2. On your knees. The guard's voice was flat, bored. It was the voice of a man who had said the same words 1,000 times. Brill knelt on the rough stone floor of the processing room. The room was small, windowless, and smelled of unwashed bodies and lye. A knife, crude and sharp, sawed through the zip tie on his wrists. The plastic parted, and blood flowed back into his hands with a pins and needles fire. He didn't rub them. He just let them hang at his sides. "The clothes," the first guard said. Brill stood and stripped without being told twice. The anonymous coveralls he'd taken from the motel, the worn t-shirt, the socks. He pushed them into a pile with his foot. He stood there, naked, under the glare of a single bare bulb. The second guard, a younger man with a nervous tick in his left eye, began the search. It was not a gentle process. His fingers probed, prodded, and dug. He checked Brill's hair, his ears, the inside of his mouth. He ran a rough finger along his gums, searching for a hidden key, a poison capsule. He found nothing but fillings. He seemed disappointed. "Nothing," the young guard said to the older one. The older guard, a man with a belly that hung over his belt and a face like a tired bulldog, grunted. He walked over to the pile of Brill's clothes and kicked it with his boot. "What about these?" The young guard picked up the clothes and searched them with a practiced efficiency, ripping the seams, checking the collar, the waistband. He found nothing. No hidden blade, no lockpick, no compass. The clothes were just clothes. He threw them into a rusty metal bin in the corner. Brill stood there, naked and empty-handed. He had nothing. No weapon. No tool. Not even a name. He was a blank slate. It was a kind of freedom. "This one," the older guard said, nodding at Brill. "Cell block C, the deep end." The young guard unlocked a heavy, iron-banded door at the far end of the room. He shoved Brill through it. They were in a long, narrow corridor, carved from the same dark volcanic rock as the rest of the fortress. The air was colder here, and the smell of the sea was stronger, mixed with the stench of human waste. Torches in iron sconces cast flickering, unreliable shadows on the damp walls. It was a place from another century. They walked past a series of heavy wooden doors with small barred slits. Faces appeared in the slits as they passed, pale and haunted, the eyes of forgotten men. A hand snaked out from one of the cells, its fingers thin as twigs, reaching for Brill. A guard smashed it with the butt of his rifle. The hand vanished with a thin, reedy cry. They stopped at the last door on the left. The older guard slid a massive iron bolt back with a grating screech of metal on metal. He unlocked a huge, ancient padlock. He pulled the door open. The cell inside was a black, waiting mouth. "Home," the guard said with a humorless chuckle. They shoved Brill inside. He stumbled on the uneven stone floor, catching himself against the far wall. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound a physical blow. The bolt slid home. The padlock clicked. He was alone in the dark. He didn't move for a full minute. He just stood there, letting his eyes adjust, letting the sounds and the smells of his new world settle over him. The darkness wasn't absolute. A faint gray light filtered in from a narrow slit high up on the far wall. It wasn't a window. It was an arrow slit, a relic from when the fortress was used to fight men with swords, not to cage them. The cell was a box of rough-hewn stone, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet. The floor was uneven, damp. The air was thick with the smell of salt and despair. In one corner was a bucket. In the other was a thin, lumpy mattress that looked like it was filled with rags and disease. That was it. Brill didn't feel fear. He didn't feel despair. Those were luxuries. They were noise. He felt the mission shift. The objective was no longer evasion or rendezvous. The new objective was simple. Survive. Observe. Escape. He began his work. He started with the sounds. He stood in the center of the cell and listened. He could hear the constant rhythmic crash of waves against the base of the cliffs. He started to time them. The rhythm was steady. The sea was a clock. He could hear the guards' footsteps in the corridor. 2 men. One had a heavy, shuffling gait. The other was lighter on his feet. They passed his cell every 32 minutes. Their route was predictable. That was a weakness. He moved to the walls. He ran his hands over the cold, damp stone. The blocks were massive, perfectly fitted by Portuguese masons 500 years ago. But the mortar was old. In some places, it had crumbled away, leaving deep crevices. He tested it with his fingernail. It was soft, sandy. He could dig it out. With what, he didn't know yet. But it was a possibility. He went to the door. It was 3 inches of solid iron-banded timber. The bolt on the outside was heavy, but the hinges on the inside were exposed. They were massive, hand-forged iron. The pins were thick as his thumb, seated deep in the wood and stone. Getting through the door was not an option. He turned his attention to the arrow slit. It was 10 feet up the wall, too high to reach. And it was only 4 inches wide. Not even a child could squeeze through it. But it was his only connection to the outside world. He needed to see. He looked around the cell. The bucket. The mattress. That was it. He went to the mattress. It was heavy, soaked with years of dampness and human misery. He dragged it across the floor and propped it against the wall under the slit. It gave him 2 feet of height. Not enough. He looked at the bucket. It was plastic, flimsy. It wouldn't hold his weight. He went back to the wall, to the crumbling mortar. He began to dig at a crevice with his fingernail, patiently, methodically. The mortar came away in a fine sandy powder. After 10 minutes of work, he had deepened the crevice by ½ an inch. He had a handhold. He found another one a foot higher. And another. It took him an hour. His fingernails were broken, his fingertips raw and bleeding. But he had created a crude ladder of handholds and footholds in the ancient stone. He climbed. The holds were shallow, treacherous. His bare feet slipped on the damp stone. But he was strong, his movements precise. He pulled himself up, his muscles screaming, until his eyes were level with the arrow slit. He pressed his face to the narrow opening. The view was limited, a vertical slice of the world. He could see a section of the courtyard, paved with the same dark stone. He could see the opposite wall of the fortress. And he could see a sliver of the sea, a brilliant, impossible blue under the harsh sun. He watched. For hours. He watched the sun track across the sky, noting its position, using it to get his bearings. The sea was to the east. He watched the guards in the courtyard. Their movements were lazy, bored. They were jailers, not soldiers. They felt safe here. That was their biggest weakness. As the sun began to set, painting the sliver of sky he could see in shades of orange and blood red, he watched the tide. The waves, which had been crashing high on the rocks at the base of the fortress, began to recede. The water level dropped. 10 feet. 20 feet. It exposed a ring of black, seaweed-covered rock at the base of the island that had been submerged before. And it exposed something else. The dark, round opening of a pipe, half hidden by the rocks. A storm drain, maybe. An old sewer outlet. It was only visible for an hour, at the lowest point of the tide, before the sea came rushing back in to reclaim it. Brill stared at the dark opening, his mind racing. It was a long shot. A suicidal, impossible chance. But it was a way out. He lowered himself back down to the floor of his cell. He sat on the damp mattress in the growing darkness. He had been here for less than a day, but he knew more about this prison than the men who guarded it. He knew its rhythms. He knew its weaknesses. He had a plan. It was a terrible plan. But it was a start. He sat in the dark and began to refine it, his mind a cold, clear engine of survival. Chapter 3. On your feet, Ghost. The voice came through the barred slit in the door, followed by the heavy, grating sound of the iron bolt being drawn back. It was the older guard, the one with the bulldog face. His voice held a new note, a kind of vicious anticipation. Brill got up from the lumpy mattress. He didn't move quickly. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion, conserving energy he knew he would need later. The massive padlock clicked open, and the heavy door swung inward, scraping against the stone floor. The older guard stood there, a lit torch in his hand that cast dancing, distorted shadows down the corridor. Behind him stood Colonel Jallow. The colonel was freshly showered, his uniform crisp, his boots polished to a high shine. He looked out of place in the ancient, filthy corridor, a clean blade in a slaughterhouse. "The president wishes to see his prize," Jallow said, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He gestured with his chin. "Out." Brill stepped out of the cell. He was naked, his skin pale under the flickering torchlight. He didn't try to cover himself. He didn't show any shame. He just stood there, his eyes not on Jallow, but on the two guards behind him, noting their positions, the way they held their rifles. "He is an animal, no?" Jallow said to the guards in his own language, loud enough for Brill to hear the contempt. "Look at him. Not so tough without his guns and his tricks." The guards chuckled nervously. "This way," Jallow commanded in English, turning on his heel. They walked down the corridor. It wasn't a long walk. They stopped in front of a larger cell, a holding area with a solid iron bar door. Inside, sitting on a single stone bench, was President Jomo Okoro. The cell had been prepared for him. The floor had been swept clean. The bench had been wiped down. A small carved wooden table stood next to it, holding a bucket of ice and a bottle of expensive French mineral water. Okoro was a king holding court in a dungeon. He wore a simple, elegant linen suit, a stark white contrast to the dark, oppressive stone. He looked relaxed, comfortable, a man completely at home surrounded by misery. The guards shoved Brill into the cell opposite Okoro's. This one was identical to his own, just as bare, just as filthy. They left him standing in the middle of the floor and locked the barred gate behind him. Now he was the animal in the cage, on display. Okoro poured himself a glass of water, the ice clinking musically against the crystal. He took a slow, deliberate sip. He looked at Brill, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I was told you were a ghost," Okoro began, his voice a soft conversational purr that was more menacing than any shout. "A man who did not exist. But you are here. You are flesh and blood. You bleed. You feel pain. This is a disappointment." Brill said nothing. He stood perfectly still, his breathing even. He was watching Okoro's hands, the way the man's long, elegant fingers held the glass. They were the hands of a surgeon or a strangler. "My brother, Adebayo," Okoro continued, swirling the water in his glass, "he believed in ghosts. He believed in spirits of the jungle, in the ancestors who watched over us. He was a spiritual man. I am not. I believe in things I can see, things I can touch." He looked at Brill's naked form. "And things I can break." Colonel Jallow stood just outside Brill's cell, his arms crossed, his smirk fixed in place. He was enjoying the show. "The men who killed my brother," Okoro said, "the mercenaries from executive options. I hunted them all. The South African, Simon, he was too slippery. He vanished. But the others, the foot soldiers, I found them. One by one. Over many years." He took another sip of water. "I learned things from them before they died. I learned about their training, about their methods, about the man they all respected, the man they were all a little afraid of, the quiet one, the one who never missed, the one they called the ghost." Okoro set his glass down on the small table with a soft click. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on Brill. "I will not ask you if it was you who pulled the trigger," he said. "To ask the question would be to give you the power of an answer. I do not need you to confess. I know. I have known for years in my heart. When my men told me of the man who rescued my daughter, of his methods, of his silence, I knew the ghost had come back from the dead." He stood up and walked to the bars of his cell, his expensive leather shoes silent on the stone floor. He was only a few feet from Brill now, separated by the iron bars. Brill could smell his cologne, a rich, spicy scent that was an obscenity in this place. "So now we have the question of justice," Okoro said. "My colonel, he wants to hang you in the courtyard. He wants to make a show of it. But that is too quick. It is an ending. And you, my friend, you have denied me an ending for 20 years. You have haunted my victory. You have been the one loose thread in the tapestry of my new nation." He reached through the bars, his hand moving slowly. He didn't try to touch Brill. He just pointed a finger at his chest. "So you will not have an ending," Okoro said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You will have a continuation. You will sit in this black rock in the dark. You will eat the slop they feed the others. You will listen to the sea and the rats. The years will pass. Your muscles will waste away. Your mind will go soft. The world, the one you moved through so silently, will forget you. The men you worked for, men like Carver, will erase your name from their files. Your money will sit in a Swiss bank account, untouched, until the bankers decide you are legally dead and claim it for themselves. You will cease to be a ghost. You will cease to be a man. You will simply become nothing. An empty space. That is my justice. A ransom of time, for the time you stole from my brother." He held Brill's gaze for a long moment, looking for a reaction. A flicker of fear. A flash of anger. A hint of despair. He found nothing. Brill's eyes were flat, calm, like polished gray stones. He was looking at Okoro, but he was seeing past him, through him. He was observing, calculating, processing. He was working. Okoro's face tightened. The lack of a reaction was a greater insult than any defiance. He had delivered his grand, vengeful pronouncement, and the ghost had not even blinked. He pulled his hand back and turned away in disgust. "Take him back to his hole," Okoro snapped at Jallo. "And double the guard. I want to know every time he breathes." He strode back to his bench, picked up his glass and sat down, his back to them. The audience was over. Jallo unlocked Brill's gate, a look of disappointment on his face. He had been hoping for some sport. He shoved Brill hard in the back. "Move, dog." They marched him back down the corridor. As they passed the other cells, the pale, haunted faces appeared in the slits again, watching the naked white man who had earned the president's personal attention. The guards threw him back into his cell. The door slammed shut. The bolt grated home. The padlock clicked. Brill stood in the darkness, listening as their footsteps faded down the corridor. He waited until he was sure he was alone. Then he walked to the far wall, the one with the arrow slit. He didn't look up at it. He knelt, his back to the door, and found the small crevice in the mortar he had started to dig out earlier. He pressed his thumb against it, feeling the rough, sandy texture. His fingernails were broken and raw, but he placed his index finger into the groove and began to scrape. Chapter 4. The slop cart arrived at the same time every day, just as the sliver of light from the arrow slit began to fade. The sound came first, the squeal of a single ungreased wheel echoing down the stone corridor. It was a sound that made the other prisoners stir in their cells, a rustling of desperate, hungry animals in their dens. Brill would be at his door, his eye pressed to the barred slit. The cart was pushed by a stooped, ancient prisoner who never looked up. Following him were two guards. One was always the bulldog-faced sergeant from his first day. The other rotated. Brill learned their faces, their gaits, the way they held their rifles. The food was a gray, watery gruel, with unidentifiable lumps in it, ladled from a big metal pot into wooden bowls. The old prisoner would slide a bowl through the slot at the bottom of each door. But Brill wasn't watching the food. He was watching the transaction. He saw the prison's geography laid out in each meal. The cells on the north side of the corridor got their bowls first. These were the political prisoners, the remnants of the old regime. Their leader, a man they called the General, was in the cell directly opposite Brill's. He was a tall, skeletal man with a white beard and eyes that still held a flicker of command. He always accepted his bowl with a quiet dignity, as if he were being served at a state dinner. The south side of the corridor belonged to the common criminals. Their leader was a man named Bakari, a mountain of scarred muscle with a flattened nose and a tattoo of a coiled serpent on his hand. Bakari's cell was a hub of activity. His bowl was always filled to the brim. Sometimes, the guard would slip a piece of bread alongside it. This was how Brill identified his target. The guard's name was Cisse. He was younger than the others, with a lean, hungry look about him. He didn't have the casual brutality of the bulldog sergeant or the nervous energy of the other young guards. He had a watchful, calculating stillness. He was the one who always gave Bakari the extra bread. Brill watched Cisse for 3 days. He saw the subtle language between the guard and the criminal leader. A nod. A glance. The briefest touch of hands as the bowl was passed. Something was being exchanged. But it wasn't just bread. The confirmation came during the 1 hour of sunlight they were allowed each day. They were herded into the main courtyard, a windswept square of stone under the open sky. The factions kept to themselves. The politicals, led by the general, would gather in the east corner, talking in low, dignified whispers, their backs straight, their pride the only thing they had left. The criminals, Bakari's crew, owned the west corner. They were loud, aggressive, a pack of hyenas establishing their territory. Brill stayed in the middle, a solitary island in the human sea. He didn't align with anyone. He just watched. He leaned against a wall, absorbing the sun, letting his muscles soak in the warmth. But his eyes were always moving. He saw Bakari approach Cisse, who was standing guard near the gate. The two men didn't speak. Bakari was complaining about the water ration, his voice loud and belligerent, a piece of theater for the other guards. But as he gestured angrily, his hand, the one with the serpent tattoo, brushed against Cisse's. Brill saw the transfer. A tiny folded piece of paper went from Bakari's hand to the guards. A moment later, Cisse, while scratching his arm, slipped something small and dark into Bakari's hand. It was a single, hand-rolled cigarette. It was a small thing. A cigarette for a piece of information. But it was the key. It was the crack in the fortress wall. Cisse was for sale. The price was just low. Brill now had a target. But he had a problem. He had nothing to sell. He had no money, no cigarettes, no information from the outside world. He was a ghost, a man with no assets. So he had to create one. He began to listen. He spent his days at the door of his cell, his ear pressed to the cold stone, filtering the sounds of the prison. He listened to the guards' gossip. He listened to the criminals' arguments. And he listened to the quiet, desperate conversations of the political prisoners. It was the general and his lieutenant, a former professor named Adebe, who gave him what he needed. Their cells were close enough that their whispers carried across the corridor to Brill's. They talked about the old days, about their families, about the hope that was slowly dying inside them. One evening, as the slop cart made its rounds, Brill heard Adebe's voice, a low, urgent whisper. "My wife," Adebe was saying. "She managed to get a message to me. Through the priest who visits once a month. She has it. The money is safe." "All of it?" the general's voice asked. "Yes. The diamonds. She buried them before your brother's house was seized. Under the old baobab tree in the west garden. No one knows. It is enough. Enough to buy a new life if we ever get out of this hell." Brill committed the words to memory. The general's brother. The west garden. The baobab tree. The diamonds. It was a treasure map whispered in the dark. It was leverage. It was an asset he could sell. But he couldn't just yell the information through the door. He had to get a meeting. He had to get the attention of the man who controlled the flow of information in this place. He had to talk to Bakari. And to get to Bakari, he had to go through Cisse. He needed to create a message. He had no paper, no pen. He had the stone floor and the crumbling mortar from the walls. He spent the next day patiently scraping a small pile of mortar dust onto a flat piece of stone he'd worked loose from the floor. He used water from his daily ration to turn the dust into a thick gray paste. It was crude paint. He waited until after the evening meal, until the guards had made their first pass of the night. Then he went to his cell door. He dipped his finger into the paste. On the rough, timbered surface of the door, just above the food slot where Cisse's hand would pass the next day, he drew a single simple symbol. A coiled serpent. He drew it perfectly from memory, the same design he had seen tattooed on the back of Bakari's hand. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plea. It was a business card. It was a signal, sent into the darkness of the prison, that a new player was in the game. It said, "I know who you are. And I have something to trade." He stepped back from the door and slid into the shadows of his cell. He sat on the lumpy mattress, his back against the cold stone, and began to wait. Chapter 5. The next day, the squeal of the slop cart's wheel was a starting pistol. Brill was at his door, his eye pressed to the slit. He watched the cart inch down the corridor, the stooped prisoner, the two guards. Today, the second guard was Cisse. The cart reached his cell. The old prisoner bent down, his movements slow and arthritic. He slid the wooden bowl through the slot. Brill didn't take it. Cisse stepped forward, his rifle held loosely. He saw the coiled serpent, drawn in gray mortar paste on the dark wood of the door. His eyes, usually watchful and calculating, widened for a fraction of a second. He looked at the barred slit, trying to see the face in the darkness behind it. Brill's voice was a low whisper, barely more than a breath, but it cut through the noise of the corridor. "Bakari." Cisse flinched as if he'd been struck. He glanced quickly at the bulldog-faced sergeant, who was at the next cell, berating a prisoner for something. The sergeant hadn't heard. Cisse looked back at the slit, his face a mixture of fear and avarice. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He kicked the bowl of gruel farther into Brill's cell and moved on. The message had been delivered. The hour in the courtyard was a pressure cooker. The sun beat down on the stone, the heat radiating in waves. Brill went to his usual spot, leaning against the wall, a solitary figure in the middle of the yard's no man's land. He watched the factions. The politicals were in their corner, a cluster of ghosts talking about a world that no longer existed. The criminals were in theirs, a loud, restless pack, their energy more aggressive than usual. Bakari was watching him. The distraction, when it came, was crude but effective. Two of Bakari's men started a loud, theatrical argument over a gambling debt, shoving each other, their voices rising. The guards, bored and hot, moved toward the argument, eager for some sport. It was the opening. Bakari detached himself from his crew and walked toward Brill, his stride a confident, rolling swagger. He was a massive man, his prison uniform stretched tight across his shoulders and chest. The serpent tattoo on his hand was a flash of dark ink against his skin. He stopped a few feet from Brill, pretending to stretch, his back to the guards. "The snake on the door," Bakari said, his voice a low rumble. "A bold move for a new fish. Cisse is scared. He thinks you are some kind of witch." "I'm a businessman," Brill said, not looking at him, his eyes still scanning the yard. "A businessman with nothing to sell," Bakari grunted. "You have no name. You have no crew. You are a white ghost in a black man's hell." What could you possibly have that I would want? Information, Brill said. Information is worth more than cigarettes, isn't it? Bakari was silent for a moment. Talk. The general, Brill said, his voice a low murmur. And his men. They look down on you. They think you are animals. But they are not starving like the rest of you. They get the same slop we do, Bakari said. They get more, Brill corrected him. The priest who visits. He brings them things. Not just blessings. Food. Real food. Dried meat. Sugar. They have a stash. Bakari turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. You are lying. Am I? Brill said. They are proud men. They would not want anyone to know they are getting special treatment. They hide it. In the old infirmary block. The one that's been abandoned. In the back room, under the loose floorboard beneath the cot. It was a complete fabrication. A shot in the dark. But it was a detailed one. And it was plausible. Why are you telling me this? Bakari asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Because I don't like being hungry, Brill said. And because I want to do business. This is a free sample. A gesture of goodwill. Bakari stared at him, his eyes trying to peel back the layers of Brill's impassive face. If you are lying to me, Ghost, I will have my men peel the skin from your bones in the middle of this courtyard, and the guards will watch. Go look for yourself, Brill said. But be smart about it. Don't let them see you. The guards broke up the fake fight, and Bakari walked away without another word. The meeting was over. Now Brill had to make the lie true. He had one chance. The old man who pushed the slop cart. He was the weakest link in the system. Brill had watched him for days. The old man was terrified of the guards, but he was more terrified of the prisoners. He moved in a constant state of fear. That afternoon, as the cart made its rounds, Brill was ready. When the old man slid the bowl through the slot, Brill didn't take it. Instead, his hand shot out, not grabbing the bowl, but the old man's thin, bony wrist. The old man froze, his eyes wide with terror. He opened his mouth to cry out. Don't, Brill whispered, his grip like iron. Not a sound. The bulldog sergeant was at the other end of the hall, distracted, hitting his rifle butt against a cell door to quiet a noisy prisoner. Cisse was watching, but he was too far away to see the details in the gloom. The bread, Brill whispered to the old man, his eyes locked on the prisoners. The extra loaf for Bakari. Give it to me. The old man shook his head, trembling. He will kill you for it, Brill said, his voice a cold, simple statement of fact. But if you don't give it to me, I will reach through this slot, and I will break your arm. And then I will tell the sergeant, you tried to steal from the pot. Who do you think he will believe? Tears welled in the old man's eyes. He looked from Brill's cold, dead eyes to the sergeant at the end of the hall. He made his choice. With a shaking hand, he reached into the cart and pulled out a small, dense loaf of dark bread. It was Bakari's payment for the day. He pushed it through the slot. Brill took the bread and released the old man's wrist. Now go. The old man scrambled away, pushing his cart, his head down. Cisse watched him go, a frown on his face. He looked at Brill's cell, then at Bakari's. He knew something had just happened, but he didn't know what. Brill now had the evidence. But he had to plant it. The old infirmary was only accessible from the courtyard. He would have to wait until the next day's sunning. It was a risk. Bakari might not wait. He might send his men that night. But Bakari was a cautious man. A leader. He wouldn't act on the word of a ghost without proof. The next day in the courtyard, the air was electric. Bakari and his crew were restless, their eyes constantly flicking toward the politicals. The general and his men seemed oblivious, standing in their usual corner, their faces serene. Brill went to his spot against the wall. He watched. He saw Bakari give a subtle hand signal to one of his lieutenants, a wiry man with a long scar down his face. The lieutenant detached himself from the group and ambled toward the abandoned infirmary block, trying to look casual. He was inside for less than 5 minutes. He came out walking slowly, but his eyes were burning. He went straight to Bakari and whispered in his ear. Bakari's face broke into a wide, predatory grin. He had found his treasure. He didn't hesitate. He turned and strode across the courtyard, his crew falling into place behind him, a wave of muscle and menace. They walked straight toward the political's corner. "General," Bakari said, his voice booming across the yard. "We need to talk." The general turned, his expression one of mild annoyance. "I have nothing to say to you, Bakari." "Oh, I think you do," Bakari said, holding up the loaf of dark bread. "My men are starving. They eat watery gruel. But you and your fine friends, you eat bread. You have a secret pantry. You have been hoarding food while the rest of us starve." The general looked at the bread, then at Bakari's face, and he understood. It was a pretext. A power play. "You are mistaken," he said, his voice cold and proud. "We have no such thing. My man found this under a floorboard in the old infirmary," Bakari lied smoothly. "Your private stash. You have been cheating us. You have been cheating the system." "That is a lie," said Adebe, the professor, stepping forward. "We would never." Bakari didn't let him finish. He backhanded the professor across the face, sending him sprawling. And with that, the courtyard exploded. The politicals, old men though they were not cowards. They surged forward to defend their friend. Bakari's crew met them with a roar. The two factions crashed together in the center of the yard, a chaotic, swirling melee of fists and feet. The guards on the walls blew their whistles, shouting orders that no one could hear. The gate to the courtyard burst open, and a squad of guards, led by the bulldog sergeant, charged in, their batons swinging. The riot was on. The entire prison's security was focused on the brawl in the courtyard. Every eye was on the chaos. No one was watching the solitary figure who slipped away from the wall, moving with a silent, deliberate purpose toward the unguarded entrance to the main cell block. Chapter 6. Get the gate. Seal the block. The voice was the bulldog sergeant's, a panicked roar from the courtyard that was almost lost in the greater chaos of the riot. Brill heard the sound of men fighting, the wet thud of batons on flesh, the screams. He moved through the main cell block corridor, a shadow in a house on fire. The torches on the walls cast wild, dancing shadows, making the stone seem to breathe. The cells he passed were alive with noise, the prisoners shouting encouragement to the brawlers, rattling their doors, adding their own fury to the symphony of violence. The corridor was empty. Every available guard, including the lazy and the cowardly, had been pulled into the courtyard to contain the explosion Brill had lit. Every guard but one. Brill knew Cisse wasn't a fighter. He was a merchant. A man like that wouldn't charge into a brawl. He would protect the assets. He would secure the back door. He found him at the far end of the cell block, at a heavy iron-barred gate that led to the prison's small administrative wing. Cisse wasn't fighting. He was locking things down, sliding a massive deadbolt into place, his movements quick and nervous. He was cutting off the riot from the rest of the prison, but he was also cutting himself off from the other guards. He had made himself an island. Brill came up behind him, his bare feet making no sound on the stone floor. The noise from the courtyard was a wall of sound, a perfect cover. Cisse finished with the bolt and turned, a self-satisfied look on his face. He had done his duty. He had been smart. He took a step and came face to face with Brill. The look on Cisse's face was a beautiful thing. The self-satisfaction curdled into confusion, then into a dawning stark terror. His mouth opened, but the scream was caught in his throat. He saw the ghost from the end of the line cell, the naked white man who had drawn a serpent on his door, standing right here. It was impossible. He fumbled for the rifle slung over his shoulder. It was a clumsy, panicked movement. Brill didn't give him time to be clumsy. He moved in, not like a fighter, but like a force of nature. He didn't go for the rifle. He went for Cisse's head. He drove the heel of his hand up and under the guard's chin, snapping his head back against the iron bars of the gate. The sound was a sharp, ugly crack of bone against metal. Cisse's eyes went wide, then unfocused. His rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering on the floor. Brill caught him before he could fall, propping him up against the gate. He wasn't dead. Just a passenger in his own skull for a few minutes. Brill's hands moved with a surgeon's precision. He unclipped the ring of keys from Cisse's belt. A big, heavy iron ring with half a dozen keys. He took the man's knife, a crude but sharp blade in a leather sheath. He took the half-empty pack of cigarettes from his pocket and the lighter. He didn't know if he'd need them, but he took them anyway. You took what you could get. Always. He let Cisse slide to the floor in a heap. He wouldn't be found for a while. Not until the riot was over, and someone came to unlock the gate. By then, Brill would be long gone. He looked at the keys. They were old, hand-forged iron. One was for the cells. One was for the gate he was standing at. But one was smaller, different. It was for a modern lock, not an ancient one. He pocketed the keys and the knife, and moved back down the corridor away from the sounds of the riot. He stopped at a low, unmarked wooden door he'd noted earlier, tucked away under a stone archway. It was the only door in the block that didn't lead to a cell. It was locked with a new brass padlock. Cisse's modern key. Brill slid the key into the lock. It turned with a quiet, satisfying click. He opened the door. The air that came out was cold and foul, the smell of stagnant water and decay. He had found the prison's guts. He slipped inside, closing the door behind him. He was in a small storage room, filled with broken buckets and coils of old rope. A single, narrow shaft descended from a hole in the floor, a stone-lined tube with a rusty iron ladder set into the wall. He started down the ladder. The rungs were slick with slime, the air growing colder and damper with every foot he descended. He was moving into the foundation of the fortress, into the rock of the island itself. The ladder ended on a narrow stone ledge overlooking a channel of black, sluggishly moving water. The prison's sewer. It flowed in a man-made tunnel, heading in the direction of the sea. This was the path. He dropped from the ledge into the water. It was waist-deep, shockingly cold and thick with filth. The stench was overwhelming. He didn't hesitate. He began to move down the tunnel, his feet sinking into a sludge of unseen things on the bottom. The tunnel was a perfect, oppressive black. He moved by touch, one hand on the rough stone wall. He could hear rats, the skittering of their claws on the stone just above the waterline. Something slick and cold brushed against his leg. He ignored it. He moved for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the slosh of the water and his own steady breathing. The air was getting thinner, harder to breathe. Then he saw it. A faint gray light ahead. He moved toward it, his pace quickening. The tunnel opened into a larger, circular chamber. In the center of the chamber was a grated opening, and through it he could see the gray, churning water of the open sea. This was the storm drain, the one he had seen from his cell. But there was a problem. The tide. It was coming in. The opening was already half submerged. The water in the chamber was rising, swirling with a powerful sucking force. He had miscalculated. The riot had taken too long. He had minutes, not hours. He waded to the grate. It was thick, rusted iron, set deep into the stone. He pulled on it. It didn't move. It was sealed by 500 years of salt and rust. He took out the knife he'd taken from Cisse. He jammed the tip into the space between the grate and the stone, trying to find purchase, trying to get some leverage. The knife blade scraped and screeched, but the grate didn't budge. The water was at his chest now, pulling at him, trying to drag him back down the tunnel. He could feel the pressure building as the incoming waves crashed against the outside of the opening. He put the knife away. He needed force. He looked around the chamber. The walls were sheer stone. There was nothing. Then he saw it. A piece of the prison's history, half buried in the sludge at the bottom of the chamber. It was a length of rusted iron, thick as his arm. An old bar from a cell door, maybe, washed down here decades ago. He dove under the foul water, his hands searching in the muck. He found it, his fingers closing around the cold, rough metal. It was heavy, unwieldy. He dragged it to the surface, gasping for air. He wedged the end of the iron bar into the gap next to the grate. He put his shoulder into it, using his legs for leverage, putting every ounce of his strength into the effort. The bar bowed under the strain. The muscles in his back and shoulders screamed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he heard it. A high-pitched groaning shriek of tortured metal. The grate shifted. A shower of rust flakes fell into the water. He pushed again, a raw, guttural roar tearing from his throat. The grate moved another inch. Then another. The opening was just wide enough. He didn't hesitate. He dropped the bar, took a final deep breath of the foul air, and dove, pulling himself headfirst through the narrow gap, the rusted iron of the grate tearing at his skin. He was through. He was out. He was in the sea, the cold, clean, violent water a shocking embrace after the filth of the sewer. He was battered by a wave, tumbled head over heels, disoriented. He fought his way to the surface, gasping, his lungs burning. He was at the base of the cliffs, the waves crashing against the black rock. The fortress loomed above him, a dark monolithic tomb. He turned his back on it and started swimming, a single naked man away from the island, out into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the open ocean. Chapter 7. The sea didn't want him. It had tried to kill him, and having failed, it threw him away. A wave, bigger than the rest, lifted him, slammed him down, and dragged his body across a bed of sharp rocks and sand, leaving him in a heap in the shallows like a piece of driftwood. He lay there for a full minute, the water washing over him, his lungs burning, every muscle in his body a screaming chorus of agony. The cuts on his skin from the sewer grate were on fire from the salt water. He had swallowed half the ocean. He pushed himself onto his hands and knees, the world spinning, and was violently sick, vomiting seawater onto the sand. He crawled, an animal pulling itself from the primeval ooze, until he was clear of the surf. He collapsed onto the wet sand, his cheek pressed against the cool, gritty surface. He had made it. He was on the mainland. He was also naked, unarmed, bleeding, and in a country where his face was a death sentence. The prison hadn't gotten smaller. It had just gotten bigger. He pushed himself up. The black citadel was a dark, jagged tooth on the horizon, maybe a mile away across the churning water. He could see faint lights moving on its walls. They knew he was gone. Or they would, soon. The riot wouldn't last forever. When the count was done, they would find one empty cell. They would look for a body first. When they didn't find one, they would look to the sea. He had to move. He staggered to his feet. The beach was a narrow strip of sand, backed by a thick, impenetrable wall of jungle. The vegetation grew right down to the high tide line, a tangle of mangrove roots and thick waxy leaves. He looked up and down the beach. It was deserted. His first priority was water. Not the salt water he'd just thrown up, but fresh water. He stumbled along the edge of the jungle, his bare feet sinking into the soft sand. He was looking for a creek, a stream, any sign of runoff from the hills inland. He found it 1/4 mile down the beach. A thin trickle of brown water, no wider than his hand, snaking out from the jungle and disappearing into the sand. He fell to his knees and drank, scooping the water into his cupped hands. It was warm and tasted of mud and decaying leaves, but it was fresh. He drank until his stomach cramped. Then he washed the salt from his wounds, hissing as the fresh water stung the raw cuts. Next, cover. He couldn't stay on the beach. He was a pale, naked target against the dark sand. He pushed his way into the jungle. The air under the canopy was thick, hot, and alive. The sounds of the sea were replaced by the chittering of insects, the calls of unseen birds, the rustle of things moving in the undergrowth. The ground was a soft, damp carpet of rotting leaves. He moved deeper, away from the coast, putting the wall of green between himself and the men who would be looking for him. He walked for an hour, his body a symphony of pain. Every step was an effort. The thorns and sharp leaves of the undergrowth tore at his bare skin, leaving a trail of new cuts. Insects, drawn by the smell of his blood and sweat, swarmed around him in a buzzing cloud. He was exposed. He needed clothes. Not for warmth, but for camouflage. For protection. He found what he was looking for, near a small, abandoned fishing shack that was slowly being swallowed by the jungle. A scarecrow stood up in a long overgrown vegetable patch. It was a pathetic thing. A cross of 2 sticks dressed in a pair of ragged, sun-bleached trousers and a long-sleeved shirt that was more holes than fabric. Brill walked up to it. He pulled the trousers off the sticks. They were rough canvas, stiff with dirt, but they were whole. He put them on. They were too short, but they would do. He took the shirt. It smelled of mildew and earth. He put it on. The sleeves were frayed, the collar gone, but it covered the pale skin of his back and arms. He was no longer a naked man. He was a scarecrow. It was an improvement. He kept moving inland, climbing into the low, rolling hills that rose from the coastal plain. He needed to get high enough to see, to understand the new prison he was in. He found a rocky outcrop that gave him a view. He lay on the warm stone and looked back the way he had come. He could see the coastline, a curving line of white sand and green jungle. He could see the blue-gray expanse of the sea. And he could hear it. A distant rhythmic whump, whump, whump. A helicopter. A single hind, flying a low search pattern along the coast, moving back and forth like a dog sniffing for a scent. They were looking for him. He watched it for a long time. It was methodical, professional. Jallows work. They wouldn't just search the coast. They would be setting up roadblocks on the few roads that cut through this part of the country. They would be visiting the villages, showing his picture, offering a reward. Every man, woman, and child would become a potential enemy. Brill looked away from the helicopter, inland. The jungle stretched for as far as he could see, a vast, unbroken sea of green. It was his only ally. It offered concealment, but it also offered starvation, disease, and 1,000 other ways to die. He had no food. He had no compass. He had a crude knife he'd taken from a dead guard, and a stolen cigarette lighter whose flint was probably soaked. He was a ghost stripped of all his tricks. All he had left was himself. His mind. His will. He checked the knife. The blade was sharp enough. He checked the lighter. He flicked it once, twice. On the third try, a weak, sputtering spark appeared. He sheltered it with his hand and flicked it again. A small brave flame bloomed in the cup of his hands. He snapped it shut. It worked. Fire was a tool. A weapon. He sat on the rock, the sun beating down on him, and he made a plan. Not a grand strategy. A simple, brutal plan for the next 24 hours. Find a reliable source of water. Find something to eat that wouldn't kill him. And keep moving, always moving, away from the coast, away from the hunters. He knew where he had to go. North. Toward the border with the next country, a lawless, unstable place where a man with his skills could disappear or find a new war to fight. It was hundreds of miles away. An impossible journey. He stood up, his body aching, his skin on fire from 100 cuts and insect bites. He looked north, at the endless green horizon. He took a single deep breath of the hot, heavy air. Then he turned his back on the sea and walked into the jungle. Chapter 8. You're burning up. The voice was a woman's, speaking a local dialect. Brill didn't understand the words, but he understood the cool, damp cloth she placed on his forehead. He was lying on his back, staring up at a ceiling he didn't recognize. It was made of corrugated tin, and a gecko was doing a slow, deliberate push-up on it. He tried to sit up. A wave of dizziness and nausea washed over him, and the world dissolved into a gray, swimming fog. A hand, firm but gentle, pushed him back down. "Easy now," a new voice said. This one was a man's, and he was speaking English with the flat, tired accent of the American Midwest. "You're in no shape to be going anywhere." Brill's vision cleared. A white man was leaning over him. He was in his late 50s, with a fringe of gray hair around a bald, sun-spotted scalp. He wore a faded blue polo shirt with a small embroidered cross over the pocket, and his face was a roadmap of deep, weary lines. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they held no illusions. They were the eyes of a man who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. Brill was lying on a narrow cot in a small, clean room. An IV bag hung from a metal stand next to him, a thin tube running to a needle taped to the back of his hand. The air smelled of antiseptic and bleach. "Where am I?" Brill's voice was a dry, rusty croak. "You're at the St. Jude Mission Clinic," the man said. "My name is Dr. Aris Rhodes." He picked up a chart from the end of the cot. "And according to the two boys who found you passed out in a stream a mile from here, your name is nothing. You had no papers. No identification. Just a bad fever, and a collection of some of the nastiest-looking cuts I've seen in a long time." Brill looked at his arms. The deep, ragged cuts he'd gotten from the sewer grate had been cleaned and stitched, the work neat and professional. His body was covered in a patchwork of antiseptic ointment and clean bandages. "The infection was turning septic," Dr. Rhodes continued, making a note on the chart. "Another 12 hours in that jungle, and you would have been food for the ants. You're a very lucky man." "Lucky," Brill repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "That's what I said." Rhodes put the chart down and looked at him, his pale blue eyes appraising. "So, the question is, who are you? The boys who found you said you looked like a geologist. We get them out here sometimes, looking for minerals. They usually have better clothes. And a satellite phone." "I was robbed," Brill said. The lie came easily, a well-worn tool. "Bandits. They took everything." "Bandits," Rhodes repeated, his expression unchanging. "Yes, we have those too. Usually, they take your boots. You weren't wearing any. And they usually leave a body. You were still breathing." He pulled a small stool over and sat down next to the cot. "The men who robbed you, they wouldn't happen to be wearing the uniform of the Kandan army, would they?" Brill didn't answer. He just looked at the doctor. The chess match had begun. "There's a manhunt going on," Rhodes said, his voice low and conversational. "Has been for the last 3 days. Colonel Jallo's men, the Night Tigers, are sweeping the province. They're looking for a foreigner. A white man. A mercenary, they say, who escaped from the Black Citadel. He paused, letting the words hang in the still hot air. They came through the village yesterday. Showed me a sketch. It wasn't a very good sketch. But it had your eyes. Brill's hand, the one without the IV, moved under the thin blanket, his fingers curling into a fist. He was weak, but he wasn't helpless. Rhodes saw the movement. He didn't seem concerned. Relax. If I was going to turn you in, I would have done it already. The bounty on your head would fund this clinic for a year. I was tempted. Why didn't you? Brill asked. Because I'm a doctor, Rhodes said with a sigh, as if the fact annoyed him. My job is to fix what's broken, not to ask why it got that way. And besides, he added, a flicker of something hard in his eyes, I have no love for Colonel Jallo or his methods. The last time his men came through here, they took all of our antibiotics for a military emergency. I lost 2 children to cholera the next week. The room was silent for a moment. So, Rhodes said, getting back to business. You're not a geologist. And you were robbed, but not by bandits. You're a political prisoner. Is that closer to the truth? It's a version of the truth, Brill said. Good enough for me, Rhodes said. He stood up. You can stay here until the fever breaks and the infection is under control. A few days. My staff, they're good people. They believe you are a geologist who had a bad piece of luck. I'd appreciate it if you didn't disabuse them of that notion. They have enough trouble in their lives without harboring a fugitive. They won't hear it from me, Brill said. I know they won't, Rhodes said. You don't seem like the talkative type. He walked to the door. You'll be safe here. For a little while. The army doesn't come this deep into the bush unless they have to. They're afraid of the ghosts in the trees. He paused at the door and looked back at Brill. You should be too. The doctor left, closing the door softly behind him. Brill lay on the cot, listening to the sounds of the clinic. The murmur of voices from another room. The cry of a baby. The clink of glass bottles. It was a place of healing, of life. And he was a sickness that had just been invited in. He knew Rhodes was right. He was safe here for now. But his presence was a time bomb. Sooner or later, Jallo's men would widen their search. They would come back. And when they did, they wouldn't just be looking for him. They would be looking for anyone who had helped him. He looked at the IV drip, the clear fluid slowly feeding life back into his veins. It was a tether. He needed to get strong. He needed to heal. And then he needed to disappear again, before he brought the ward to the doorstep of the only man who had shown him a moment of grace. He closed his eyes not to sleep, but to plan, his mind already working on the next move, on the next escape. Chapter 9. The fever is broken. The voice belonged to Anique, the young Camden nurse who had been the first face he'd seen in the clinic. She was changing the dressing on his arm, her touch gentle but efficient. Her English was careful, learned from a book. Dr. Rhodes says you are a very strong man. Or a very stubborn one. Is there a difference? Brill asked, his voice still a dry rasp. He was sitting up on the edge of the cot, his bare feet on the cool concrete floor. It was the 3rd day. The IV was gone. The world had stopped spinning. The pain had receded to a dull, manageable throb. Anique smiled, a brief shy flash of white teeth. Perhaps not. She finished taping the bandage. You must eat. To get your strength back. She left a bowl of thin rice porridge and a cup of water on the small table next to him. Brill waited until she was gone. He ate the porridge in 3 swallows. It was bland, but it was fuel. He drank the water. Then he stood up. His legs were shaky, his body a stranger to him. He walked the length of the small room, a cage of 6 paces, He tested his weight, felt the pull of the stitches in his side. He began a series of slow, deliberate stretches, pushing through the pain, reacquainting himself with his own physical limits. He was a machine that had been damaged, and he was running diagnostics. Dr. Rhodes found him like that an hour later, standing in the center of the room, his body covered in a thin sheen of sweat. "I see you're feeling better," Rhodes said, leaning against the doorframe. He held a battered copy of a geology textbook. "Found this in my library. Thought our resident geologist might enjoy some light reading." Brill stopped stretching. He looked at the book, then at Rhodes's face. The doctor's expression was mild, but his eyes were sharp. The game was still on. "Thank you," Brill said. He took the book. The cover was faded, the pages soft with humidity. "I was reading the chapter on the Kivu shield," Rhodes said, his voice casual. "Fascinating stuff. All that Precambrian rock. Rich in coltan, I hear. And diamonds." He looked at Brill. "Is that what you were looking for? Diamonds?" "I was mapping gneiss and granite outcrops for a Canadian survey company," Brill said, the lie smooth and practiced. He opened the book, flipping through the pages as if he were interested. "The money is in the coltan, but you have to understand the underlying geology." "Of course," Rhodes said. "You have to understand what's underneath." He watched Brill for a moment longer. "Anik tells me you haven't been sleeping much." "I'm not tired," Brill said. "No," Rhodes said. "You're not. You're like a wolf I once saw in a trap. It didn't howl. It didn't struggle. It just stayed quiet, watching, waiting for its chance to either escape or to bite the hand that came too close." He pushed himself off the doorframe. "Lunch is at noon. If you feel up to it." He left Brill alone with the book and the unspoken accusation. For 2 more days, Brill played the part of the patient. He ate the food they brought him. He walked in the small, walled garden behind the clinic, feeling the sun on his face, rebuilding his strength. He spoke when spoken to, answering Anik's gentle questions with vague, non-committal answers about his life as a geologist. He was a model of quiet recovery. But at night, when the clinic was silent, except for the hum of the small generator and the chorus of the jungle, he worked. He did push-ups and sit-ups in his small room, until his muscles screamed and the stitches in his side pulled. He tested his balance, his speed. He was pushing his body, forcing it to heal, forcing it to be ready. And he listened. He heard the helicopters again, a distant, menacing beat in the night sky. They were farther away now, but they were still there. The hunters were still hunting. On the morning of the 6th day, Dr. Rhodes left in his ancient Land Rover to drive to the village, a 2-hour trip for medical supplies and mail. He was gone all day. Brill was in the garden when he returned, late in the afternoon. The sound of the Land Rover's struggling engine was a familiar comfort to the clinic staff. But when the vehicle pulled up, Brill could see that something was wrong. Rhodes didn't get out right away. He just sat behind the wheel, his hands resting on it, staring into space. When he finally got out, his face was gray. The weary lines seemed deeper, etched in stone. He walked past Anik, who had come out to greet him without a word. He walked straight to the garden where Brill was standing. "My office," Rhodes said. His voice was a low, tight command. "Now." Brill followed him. Rhodes's office was a small, cluttered room that smelled of old books and antiseptic. He closed the door and turned to face Brill. He tossed a piece of paper onto his desk. It was a wanted poster, a crude, computer-generated sketch of a man's face. The likeness was terrible, but it didn't matter. The artist had gotten the eyes right. They were Brill's eyes. "They were in the village," Rhodes said, his voice shaking with a quiet, suppressed rage. Jallo's night tigers. They weren't asking questions this time. They were tearing the place apart. They went through every house. They overturned the market stalls. They were looking for you. He pointed at the poster. This was nailed to the door of the headman's hut. There's a bounty. 50,000 American dollars. Alive. 100,000 if you're dead. Brill looked at the poster, his face impassive. A man, Rhodes continued, his voice low and intense. A farmer named Joseph. He told them he saw a white man near the river a few days ago. He thought he was helping. He thought he was being a good citizen. Rhodes leaned across the desk, his knuckles white. They took him. Jallo's lieutenants said he was a collaborator. They put a bag over his head and threw him in the back of their truck. His wife and children were watching. They were screaming. Rhodes's composure finally broke. He slammed his fist on the desk, rattling a jar of pens. This is what you bring here. This is the world you carry around with you. I didn't ask to be brought here, Brill said, his voice cold. No, Rhodes said, taking a deep, shuddering breath. No, you didn't. I did. I brought you here. He sank into his chair, the anger draining out of him, leaving only a vast, empty weariness. So now you have to tell me. Not a lie about being a geologist. Not a half-truth about being a political prisoner. The real truth. Who are you? Why are they hunting you like this? Brill was silent for a long time. He looked at the weary, decent man in front of him. He looked at the crude sketch of his own face. The lie had run its course. It was time for a new one. A better one. I'm a soldier, Brill said. Or I was. I worked for the old government. During the Civil War. Rhodes looked up, his eyes narrowing. You were a mercenary. I was a contractor, Brill corrected him. I was hired to fight against Okoro's rebellion. When he won, his men captured me. They sent me to the Black Citadel. It was a version of the truth. It was the part of the truth that this man, who hated Okoro and his methods, could understand. It made him a soldier on the losing side, not a hired killer who had murdered the president's brother. So you are a political prisoner, Rhodes said, the pieces clicking into place for him. Yes, Brill said. Rhodes looked at the poster again, at the bounty. And now you've escaped. And Okoro wants you back. Badly. He looked at Brill, his face a mask of conflict. He was a doctor, a man of peace, and he was harboring a soldier, a man of violence. But he was a soldier who had fought against the man who had stolen his clinic's medicine and abducted his neighbors. They will come here, Rhodes said, his voice a whisper. It's only a matter of time. I know, Brill said. I'll be gone by morning. Where will you go? Rhodes asked. They have patrols on every road. They're watching the borders. Brill didn't answer. He just stood there, his mind already working, calculating the new odds, the new risks. He had his strength back. The infection was gone. The time for healing was over. He walked to the office door. He paused, his hand on the knob. The farmer, he said, his back to Rhodes. The one they took. What will happen to him? They'll torture him for information he doesn't have, Rhodes said, his voice hollow. And then they'll kill him. They'll leave his body on the side of the road as a warning to the others. Brill stood there for a moment, the weight of the man's words settling on him. Then he opened the door and walked out, leaving the doctor alone with the wanted poster and the terrible choice he had made. Chapter 10. You can't leave tonight. Dr. Rhodes's voice was a low, insistent whisper. He stood in the doorway of Brill's small room, a silhouette against the warm, lamplit hallway of the clinic. Outside the jungle was a wall of sound, a chorus of insects and things with no names. They'll have patrols on the roads, Rhodes continued. They'll be watching the river. You go out there now, in the dark, you'll walk right into their arms. Brill didn't look at him. He was standing by the room's single barred window, methodically tearing a strip from the bottom of the thin cotton sheet on his cot. "They're not on the roads. They're in the jungle. I can hear them." Rhodes was quiet for a moment. He couldn't hear anything but the familiar sounds of the night. "The helicopters?" "No," Brill said. "Dogs. A long way off. But the sound carries when the air is still." He finished tearing the strip of cloth and began to wrap it tightly around the handle of the crude knife he'd taken from the prison guard. He was building a better grip. "You can't fight a whole army, son," Rhodes said, his voice laced with a weary resignation. "Whatever you were, whatever you did, you're just one man." "One man is harder to find than two," Brill said. He tested the knife's new grip. It felt solid in his hand. He had spent the day sharpening the blade on the concrete floor of his room, honing it to a razor's edge. He had also taken something from the clinic's small supply room when Anik wasn't looking. A single disposable scalpel, still in its sterile package. It was small, but it was a tool of surgical lethality. A commotion from the main clinic room interrupted them. A woman's voice raised in alarm. A man's groaning in pain. Rhodes was already moving. "Stay here," he commanded and hurried out. Brill didn't stay there. He followed, a shadow in the hallway. He stopped at the door to the main ward, a larger room with 4 cots. A man lay on one of the cots, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. He was a villager, a farmer by his worn clothes and calloused hands. His wife stood beside him, her face a mask of terror, speaking in a frantic, low dialect to Anik, who was trying to calm her. Rhodes was examining the man's leg. The bone was clearly broken. But that wasn't the worst of it. The man's face was a swollen, bruised mess. His eyes were puffed shut. Someone had worked him over with fists or a rifle butt. "What happened?" Rhodes asked the woman in her own language. She answered, her voice trembling, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. Rhodes's face went gray. He looked up from the wounded man, and his eyes found Brill's in the shadows of the hallway. "He didn't come here on his own," Rhodes said to Brill in English, his voice hollow. "He was brought. A gift." He nodded toward the clinic's front door. Brill moved to the door and looked out through the screen. A Kandan army truck was parked in the clearing, its engine idling, its headlights cutting 2 brilliant white cones through the darkness. 2 of Jallo's night tigers stood by the truck, smoking, their rifles held casually. They weren't looking at the clinic. They were looking at the jungle, their heads turning at every sound. They were listening. Just like him. "They found him on a path 2 miles from here," Rhodes said, his voice a dead monotone from behind Brill. "They asked him if he'd seen a white man. He said no. They didn't believe him." He paused. "They told his wife to bring him here. They said it was a message. For me." "What was the message?" Brill asked. "They said the next person they find lying will not be so lucky. And the person who is hiding him will be even less lucky." Rhodes walked over to a small basin and began to scrub his hands with soap and water, a furious, methodical motion. "They're not searching randomly anymore. They're closing the circle. They're using terror as a tool to make the jungle smaller." Brill watched the 2 soldiers by the truck. They were patient. They weren't here to raid the clinic. Not yet. They were a statement of purpose. A calling card. They were telling Rhodes, and anyone else who might be listening, that they were here. That they knew. "They'll wait until morning," Brill said. "They don't want to come into the clinic at night. They don't know how many people are here. They don't know if we're armed." "We have a single-shot shotgun for snakes," Rhodes said bitterly. "And I'm not sure I remember where the shells are." "They don't know that," Brill said. He watched as one of the soldiers dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. He said something to the other, and they both laughed. "They're going to kill us all, aren't they?" Rhodes asked, his voice devoid of emotion. He was a man looking at a diagnosis he couldn't treat. "They'll kill you to get to me," Brill corrected him. "And they'll kill your staff as a lesson to the other villages." Rhodes finished washing his hands and dried them on a clean towel. He turned and faced Brill. The weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a hard, cold resolve. "Then you can't leave." Brill looked at him. "What?" "You heard me," Rhodes said. "You walk out that door tonight, you lead them away from here, and you save us. That's the logical, tactical thing to do. I'm sure it's what you were planning." "It was a consideration," Brill admitted. "But they'll still kill that farmer Joseph," Rhodes continued, his voice low and intense. "The one they took from the village. They'll kill him to make a point. And they'll come back here eventually. They'll find your tracks. They'll know you were here. And they'll punish us for lying. Your leaving doesn't save us. It just postpones the inevitable." "What's your point, Doctor?" "My point," Rhodes said, walking closer until he was standing right in front of Brill, "is that I took an oath to do no harm. For years I've watched Okoro's men like those out there, harm my people. I have patched them up, and I have buried them. I have done nothing. I have been a good, neutral observer." He looked past Brill, at the two soldiers standing in the glare of the headlights. "Tonight, I am done being neutral." He looked back at Brill. "You are a wolf. I can see it in your eyes. I took you in, and now the hunters are at my door. But they are not just hunting you. They are hunting my flock." He took a deep breath. "So I am asking the wolf to guard the sheep." Brill stared at him. At this man of peace, this man of medicine, who was asking him to do the one thing he was built for. "You want me to fight them," Brill said. "I want you to stop them," Rhodes corrected. "I want you to make them go away. I want you to use the violence that you carry inside you like a disease to cure the one that is standing on my doorstep." Brill looked out the screen door again. The two soldiers were getting impatient. One of them walked toward the clinic, his rifle held at a low ready. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and peered into the darkness of the porch. "Doctor," he called out in the local dialect, "we are tired of waiting. We want to talk to your guest." Brill looked at Rhodes. The doctor's face was pale, but his jaw was set. He gave a single, sharp nod. Brill didn't say a word. He just took the scalpel from his pocket, its sterile package crinkling softly. He palmed it in his left hand. In his right, he held the crude knife from the prison. He moved away from the door, melting into the deepest shadows of the clinic's main room, becoming a part of the darkness, and waited for the hunters to step inside. Chapter 11. The screen door creaked open. The sound was a gunshot in the tense silence of the clinic. The soldier who had been watching from the truck stepped onto the porch, his rifle held across his chest. He was young, with the easy arrogance of a man who has never been properly afraid. His shadow, cast by the truck's headlights, fell long and distorted across the floor of the main ward. "Doctor," the soldier called out again, his voice impatient. "My lieutenant is not a patient man." From the deepest shadows of the room, Brill watched. He held the prison knife in his right hand, the grip now solid and sure. In his left, he palmed the scalpel, its plastic casing a small, hard promise of surgical violence. He was a coiled spring, every muscle tensed. He could cross the room in 2 seconds, cut the man's throat, and be on the second soldier before he could even raise his rifle. It would be bloody. It would be loud. And it would be the end of this place. Dr. Rhodes stepped out of the hallway, moving between Brill and the door, a small, unarmed man in a faded polo shirt placing himself in the path of a predator. "There is a sick man here," Rhodes said to the soldier, his voice steady, authoritative. He spoke in the local dialect, his tone that of a doctor, not a victim. And a woman in labor. Your noise is not helping. The soldier sneered. We are not here for your sick peasants, old man. We are here for the white man. The ghost. We know he is here. There is a geologist here, Rhodes said, his voice not wavering. An employee of a Canadian survey company. He was attacked by bandits. He is my patient. Under the Camden Accords for Foreign Aid Workers, this clinic is a neutral space. You are not welcome here. The soldier laughed, a short, ugly sound. Neutral. There is no neutral ground in a hunt. He took a step into the room, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He saw the wounded farmer on the cot, his terrified wife, the wide-eyed Anik. He was looking for another white face. I am telling you to leave, Rhodes said, his voice rising, taking on an edge of command. If you take one more step into my clinic, I will file a report with the International Aid Commission and the American Embassy. Your colonel will not be pleased. The soldier hesitated. The threat of paperwork, of a complaint that would have to be answered, was a more effective weapon than any shotgun. He was just a foot soldier. He didn't want that kind of trouble. He was about to say something, to back down, when the second soldier, the lieutenant in charge of the small patrol, walked up onto the porch behind him. He was older, with a long, thin scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He was not a man who was afraid of paperwork. The doctor is being uncooperative? The lieutenant asked, his voice a low, dangerous purr. He speaks of accords, sir, the young soldier said. The lieutenant smiled, a cold, thin smile. Ah, yes. The accords. He stepped into the clinic, pushing past Rhodes as if he weren't there. His eyes swept the room, taking in every shadow, every corner. He looked at Brill's empty cot in the small side room, the sheet rumpled. His eyes narrowed. A geologist, the lieutenant said, turning back to Rhodes. From Canada. How interesting. We have been looking for a man. Also, a geologist, perhaps. He seems to have lost his identification. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a folded, creased piece of paper. The wanted poster. He unfolded it and held it up. The crude sketch was a caricature, but it was enough. Anik, standing by the farmer's cot, let out a small, sharp gasp. She looked from the paper to the shadows in the hallway where Brill had been standing. The lieutenant's eyes followed her gaze. He saw nothing but darkness, but a hunter's instinct told him he was looking in the right place. So, the lieutenant said softly, his eyes still on the dark hallway. It seems our lost geologist is here after all. He looked at Rhodes. You have been lying to us, doctor. That is a very serious crime. Harboring a fugitive. An enemy of the state. He is my patient, Rhodes said, his voice tight. My oath does not ask for a man's politics before I treat his wounds. Your oath is not the law of this land, the lieutenant said. He nodded to his soldier. Search the clinic. Find him. The young soldier raised his rifle and took a step toward the hallway. Brill knew the moment was over. The bluff had failed. He tensed, ready to move. I wouldn't do that, if I were you. The voice came from the darkness behind the soldiers, from the screen door that led to the porch. It was Anik. She was holding the clinic's snake gun, an old single-barreled shotgun, and it was pointed directly at the lieutenant's back. Her hands were trembling so badly, the long barrel of the gun was making small, erratic circles in the air, but she was holding it. The lieutenant stopped. He turned his head slowly. He saw the young nurse, her face a mask of terror and resolve. He saw the shotgun. He probably knew it was the only weapon in the clinic. He probably knew she had never fired it before. But he also knew that a cornered, terrified person with a shotgun was more unpredictable, and in some ways more dangerous than a trained soldier. He smiled his cold smile. It seems the doctor's staff is as brave as he is foolish. He looked back at Rhodes. You have made a very powerful enemy tonight, Doctor. You and your brave nurse. He slowly raised his hands, a gesture of mock surrender. We will leave. For now. But we will be back. And we will not be so polite next time. He nodded to his soldier. They backed out of the clinic slowly, their eyes still scanning the shadows. They got into their truck. The engine roared to life, and the truck turned around, its headlights sweeping across the front of the clinic, before it disappeared back down the dark jungle track. The clinic was silent. The only sound was the ragged, shaky breathing of Anik, who was still holding the heavy shotgun. It wavered in her hands, and then clattered to the floor. She slumped against the wall, her legs giving out. Rhodes didn't go to her. He walked to the door and bolted it. He turned and looked into the shadows where Brill stood. She could have been killed, Rhodes said, his voice a raw whisper. She was going to be killed anyway, Brill replied, stepping out of the darkness. You both were. Rhodes stared at him, at the crude prison knife in one hand and the scalpel in the other. He looked at the wanted poster, still lying on the floor where the lieutenant had dropped it. He finally saw the wolf he had invited into his home. My office, Rhodes said, his voice a dead, hollow command. He turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his decision settling on him like a shroud. Brill looked at Anik, who was now being tended to by the farmer's wife. He looked at the wounded man on the cot. He had brought the war here. He had made these people targets. He turned and followed the doctor, the knife and the scalpel still in his hands. Chapter 12. So that's it then. Dr. Rhodes's voice was flat in the heavy silence of his office. He sat behind his cluttered desk, the wanted poster lying between them like a dead thing. We wait for them to come back. We wait for them to burn this place to the ground. Brill stood by the office window, looking out into the impenetrable darkness where the army truck had disappeared. The two soldiers were gone, but the jungle felt different now. Watched. They won't come back tonight, he said. The lieutenant wants to make you sweat. He thinks fear is a better weapon than a rifle. Is he wrong? Rhodes asked, his voice laced with a bitter self-loathing. He looked at his hands, as if he couldn't believe they were the same ones that had set broken bones and delivered babies. Fear makes you predictable, Brill said, turning from the window. He thinks he knows what you're going to do. He thinks you'll panic. Maybe try to run. He'll have patrols waiting on the paths, at the river. He's laid a trap, and he's waiting for the rabbit to run into it. And you're not a rabbit. No, Brill said. I'm not. He walked over to the desk and picked up the wanted poster. He looked at the crude sketch of his own face. But I can't stay here. I've made this place a target. As long as I'm here, you and your staff are in danger. And where exactly do you plan to go? Rhodes asked, the question sharp with a desperate, angry sarcasm. Will you simply walk to the border? Perhaps you'll swim the ocean? Brill didn't answer right away. He was watching the doctor, gauging the man's resolve. Rhodes had made a choice tonight. He had stood up to the soldiers. He had, in his own way, declared war. But there was a difference between a moment of righteous anger and the long, dirty business of survival. I need to make a call, Brill said. Rhodes stared at him. A call. The phone lines were cut by Okoro's men 5 years ago. There is no call to be made. Not on a phone, Brill said. I need a radio. A shortwave. Rhodes went very still. He looked at Brill, his eyes narrowing. The air in the small office crackled with a new tension. He had kept secrets. But he was beginning to realize the man in front of him was made of nothing but secrets, layered one on top of the other like sheets of black ice. Why, Rhodes said, his voice a careful, measured whisper, would you think I have a shortwave radio? Because you're a man who doesn't trust his government, Brill said simply. Because you're smart enough to know that in a country like this, the only reliable communication is the one you control yourself. Because you've been sending out reports to the international aid commissions, and I don't think you've been doing it by mail. Rhodes was silent for a long time. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in protest. He looked at the diplomas on his wall, the pictures of his smiling, long-dead wife. He looked at everything that defined his life of careful, quiet service. And then he looked at the man who was threatening to burn it all down. He got up from his desk and walked to a tall, metal filing cabinet in the corner of the room. He unlocked it with a key from the chain on his belt. He pulled open the bottom drawer. It was filled with patient files, alphabetized and neatly arranged. He reached behind the files and pressed something. There was a faint click, and a false back panel swung inward. Inside, nestled in a bed of old foam padding, was a Yaesu FT-817. A small, portable all-band transceiver. Beside it was a spool of copper wire for an antenna and a small, hand-cranked generator. Rhodes pulled the radio out and set it on his desk. It was a declaration. An admission. He was no longer just a doctor. He was a co-conspirator. Who are you calling? Rhodes asked. A man I used to know, Brill said. A businessman. What kind of business? He's in the import-export trade, Brill said. He moves things. Things other people can't move. Or won't. A smuggler, Rhodes said, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. He prefers logistics expert, Brill said. His name is Jean-Pierre. He operates out of a port city on the coast. A place with no laws and a lot of guns. If I can get a message to him, he can arrange a boat. Rhodes ran a hand over his face. He felt as if he had stepped through a door into a world he had only read about in cheap paperback novels. A world of smugglers and soldiers of fortune and men with bounties on their heads. And you think this logistics expert will just come to your rescue? Out of the goodness of his heart. Jean-Pierre doesn't have a heart, Brill said. He has a ledger. And he only does things that add up in his favor. So what will this cost? Rhodes asked, though he already suspected the answer. He looked around his small, cluttered office, at the clinic just beyond the door. There was nothing here of value. Nothing but the lives of the people inside it. It will cost whatever he wants to charge, Brill said. And he will want something he can sell. Something valuable and hard to get in this part of the world. He let his eyes drift toward the clinic's supply room. Rhodes followed his gaze. The understanding dawned on him, slow and sickening. The medicine. He'll want all of it, Brill said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a statement of fact. The antibiotics. The antivirals. The painkillers. The surgical supplies. Everything. A full clinic's worth of modern medicine would be a fortune on the black market in a place like Port Henri. Rhodes felt a wave of nausea. He saw the faces of the villagers who depended on him. The children with malaria. The old women with infections. He saw the future, a long line of sick and dying people he would be powerless to help. All for this one man. This one ghost who had appeared out of the jungle and brought the apocalypse with him. No, Rhodes said, the word a strangled whisper. I can't. It's everything we have. It's the only thing you have that's worth my life, Brill said. That's the math Jean-Pierre will do. And it's the only math that matters right now. He leaned forward, his voice dropping, becoming a low, intense hiss. Those soldiers are coming back, Doctor. When they do, they will kill you. They will kill Anik. They will kill your patients. And then they will burn this place down until there's nothing left but ashes. No medicine. No clinic. Nothing. You're not saving your medicine by saying no. You're just dying with it." Rhodes closed his eyes. He heard the man's words, cold and brutal and true. He had taken an oath to do no harm. But what was the greater harm? To sacrifice the future to save the present? To become a monster to fight a monster? He opened his eyes. He looked at Brill, at the killer he was about to make a deal with. "All right," Rhodes said, his voice a dead, hollow thing. The compromise settled in his gut like a stone. "All of it." Brill gave a single, sharp nod. He took a pen from the doctor's desk and tore a corner from the wanted poster. He wrote down a frequency and a short phrase. "Here," he said, sliding the piece of paper across the desk. "This is the frequency. Broadcast on single sideband. He listens for 5 minutes at the top of every hour." Rhodes picked up the paper. The frequency was a string of numbers. The phrase was just 3 words. "Patient has relapsed." "What does it mean?" Rhodes asked. "It means an old associate needs a house call," Brill said. He looked at the radio on the desk, then at the doctor. "You should get started. The top of the hour is in 15 minutes." Rhodes didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the radio, at the piece of paper in his hand. He had crossed a line. There was no going back. Brill walked to the door. "And doctor," he said, pausing with his hand on the knob, "crank the generator quietly." He slipped out of the office, leaving Rhodes alone with the radio, the price of their bargain, and the ghost of the man he used to be. Chapter 13. Did he answer? Dr. Rhodes's voice was a dry rasp in the humid confines of his office. He had his head pressed against the speaker of the Yaesu transceiver, as if he could will a response from the crackling static. The 5-minute broadcast window had closed. There was nothing but the sound of an empty channel. "No," Brill said. He was standing across the room, by the door, watching the hallway. "He won't. Not on the first call." "But you said—" "I said he listens," Brill cut in, his voice low and devoid of comfort. "He heard you. Now he's thinking. He's doing the math. He's deciding if the risk is worth the reward." "And what if it isn't?" Rhodes asked, looking up from the radio. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes wide with a dawning terrible regret. "What if he decides it's not worth the trouble?" "Then you'll have to make another call in 54 minutes, Brill said. "And the price will go up." He didn't have to explain what the new price would be. They both knew. The only thing left to offer was their lives. Brill pushed himself off the doorframe. The waiting had begun, but he wasn't a man who waited idly. He was a man who used the time his enemies gave him. He walked out into the main ward. The farmer Joseph was sleeping fitfully on his cot, his wife curled on a mat on the floor beside him. Anique sat in a chair in the corner, the useless snake gun lying across her lap. She was watching the front door, as if she expected Jallo's men to burst through it at any second. She looked up as Brill entered, her eyes tracking him with a mixture of fear and a desperate, fragile hope. He ignored her. He was assessing the room, not as a place of healing, but as a kill zone. He saw the 2 windows, the front door, the hallway leading to the back. 4 points of entry. 4 potential funnels for an attack. He walked over to the clinic's small, makeshift kitchen area. He found a large cast-iron pot filled with water for boiling bandages. He lifted it. It was heavy. He carried it to the front door and placed it on the floor. He then took a spool of suture thread from a nearby supply tray. It was thin, almost invisible in the dim light. He knelt by the door and began to work, his movements precise and economical. He tied one end of the thread to the pot's handle. He ran the other end up the doorframe and across the top, securing it to a small nail that held a faded calendar. He adjusted the tension until the pot was balanced precariously. Anique watched him, her knuckles white on the stock of the shotgun. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "Making the door heavy," Brill said without looking up. He stood and tested it. A man bursting through the door would trip the thread, bringing 20 pounds of iron and boiling water down on his head. It wouldn't kill him, but it would stun him. It would blind him, and it would give Brill the half-second he needed. He moved to the windows next. He found a box of glass microscope slides in the small lab area. He began breaking them carefully, creating a small pile of razor-sharp shards. He sprinkled them on the floor beneath the windows, a carpet of transparent caltrops that would shred the boots and the feet of anyone trying to climb through. Rhodes appeared in the doorway of his office. He watched Brill's quiet, methodical work, and a fresh wave of nausea washed over him. He had spent his life putting things back together, mending torn flesh, setting broken bones. And now he was watching a man turn his sanctuary into a charnel house, using the very tools of healing as instruments of death. "This is insane," Rhodes breathed. "You can't fight an army with cooking pots and broken glass." "I'm not fighting an army," Brill said, his voice a low rumble. He was now taking bottles of rubbing alcohol from a supply shelf. "I'm fighting a handful of men who think they're walking into a room full of sheep. I'm just reminding them that sometimes the sheep bite back." He took a roll of bandages and began stuffing a strip into the neck of an alcohol bottle. He was making Molotov cocktails. Crude, but effective in a confined space. The minutes ticked by, each one a small lifetime. The jungle outside was a constant oppressive presence, a wall of sound that seemed to be growing louder, closer. Every snap of a twig, every call of a night bird was the sound of approaching death. Rhodes went back into his office and sat by the radio, his hands trembling. He had given away his medicine. He had betrayed his oath. And for what? For the slim chance that a smuggler he had never met would answer a call from a ghost. He felt a profound, soul-crushing despair. He had become a part of the violence he had so long despised. The top of the hour arrived. Brill walked back into the office. He looked at Rhodes, who was still sitting frozen in his chair. "It's time," Brill said. Rhodes looked up, his eyes hollow. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Brill said. He walked over to the desk and picked up the hand crank generator. He began to turn it, a steady, rhythmic motion. The radio's display flickered to life. "You made a deal, Doctor. Now you hold up your end." Rhodes stared at the microphone. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He picked it up. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely hold it. "What if he still doesn't answer?" he whispered. "Then you'll have your answer," Brill said, his voice flat. He didn't stop cranking the generator. Rhodes took a deep breath. He pressed the transmit button. "Patient has relapsed," he said, his voice a strained croak. He repeated the phrase 3 times, then let go of the button. They waited. The static hissed from the speaker, a long, empty sigh. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Nothing. Rhodes's shoulders slumped. It was over. They were alone. And then a voice. So faint, it was almost lost in the static. A crackle of French-accented English. "Rendezvous point. Coordinates to follow, 24 hours." The voice cut out, replaced by another burst of static. Brill stopped cranking. He looked at Rhodes. "Did you get it?" Rhodes was staring at the radio, his mouth agape. He had heard it. A voice from another world. A promise. "Again," Brill commanded. Rhodes pressed the transmit button. "Repeat. Repeat your last." The voice came back, a little clearer this time. A string of numbers. A latitude and longitude. The old logging camp east of the river, you know the one. A pause, and bring the payment. All of it. No payment, no ride. Out. The channel went dead. Rhodes slowly put the microphone down. He looked at Brill. The man's face was unreadable, a mask of cold professional calm. But his eyes were alive, burning with a new intensity. The waiting was over. The hunt was on. Brill walked out of the office and into the main ward. He went to the supply room, where the clinic's precious stock of medicine was kept on neat, orderly shelves. He grabbed an empty canvas duffel bag from a hook on the wall. He walked back to Rhodes, who was still sitting at his desk, stunned into silence. Brill threw the bag onto the desk in front of him. "Start packing, doctor," he said. "Jean-Pierre is coming to collect." Chapter 14. Every box is a life. Dr. Rhodes's voice was a dead thing in the sterile air of the supply room. He held a small cardboard box of ampicillin vials, turning it over and over in his hands as if it were a religious artifact. His face was the color of old parchment. "It's just wait now, doctor." Brill's voice was clipped, impatient. He moved past Rhodes and began pulling entire trays of antibiotics off the shelves, dumping them unceremoniously into one of the heavy canvas duffel bags. The sound of glass clinking against glass was a small, sharp sound of betrayal. "And we have to carry it." Anique stood in the doorway, watching them. She held another empty duffel bag, her knuckles white where she gripped the canvas. Her eyes darted from Rhodes's agonized face to Brill's cold efficiency. She looked like a child caught between two warring parents. One was grieving the death of his world. The other was busy looting the grave. "We should be careful," she said, her voice a small, hesitant protest. "If they break." "If they break, Jean-Pierre doesn't pay," Brill said without looking at her. He zipped the first bag shut. It was heavy, a dead weight of hope and compromise. He grabbed the bag she was holding. "Fill this one with the surgical kits. The scalpels, the sutures, the clamps. And the morphine. All of it." Rhodes flinched as if struck. "The morphine? There are people in the village." "There are no more people in the village, doctor," Brill said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. He stopped what he was doing and turned to face the old man. The supply room suddenly felt very small. "There is only us. And them. And the jungle. The people in the village are ghosts. You can't help them anymore. You can only help us." He jabbed a finger at the bags on the floor. "This is the price of a boat ride. Nothing more." Rhodes looked away, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He picked up a box of sterile bandages and placed it in the bag, his movements slow and defeated, the actions of a man arranging flowers on a tomb. They worked in silence for the next 20 minutes, a grim, efficient team of thieves stripping a sanctuary bare. Brill directed the operation with a cold, detached authority. He knew exactly what had value on the black market. He pointed to boxes of anti-malarial drugs, IV kits, even the clinic's small portable autoclave. Everything went into the bags. When they were done, 4 heavy duffel bags sat on the floor of the supply room. The shelves were almost bare. The clinic had been gutted, its lifeblood packed away as payment for a smuggler. Brill hefted one of the bags. It was at least 60 pounds. "We can't carry all of this," he said. "I told you," Rhodes mumbled. "I know what you told me," Brill said. He looked at Anique. "Is there a boat? A canoe? Anything at the village that floats?" She shook her head. "The soldiers took them. After the last time, the river flooded. They said it was to prevent people from escaping." Brill nodded. It made sense. Control the lines of travel. He walked out into the main ward and looked around, his eyes scanning the room, not for what was there, but for what he could make from it. He saw the metal frame of a patient cot, the wooden planks of the front door. He was already calculating weight and buoyancy. "We'll build a raft," he said. A raft. Rhodes had followed him out, his face a mask of disbelief. "With what?" "With this place," Brill said. He pointed to the front door. "We'll take the door off its hinges. And that cot. We'll need rope." "We're not sailors," Rhodes said, his voice rising with a note of hysteria. "We're not builders. We'll sink." "Then we'll swim," Brill said. He walked into Rhodes's office and came back with a faded map of the region that had been pinned to the wall. He spread it out on the floor, weighting the corners with bottles of saline solution he'd left behind. The three of them gathered around it, a small, desperate circle in the dim light of the dying clinic. Brill's fingers stabbed at the map. "We are here," he said. He traced a thin blue line that snaked through the green expanse of the jungle. "This is the river. It flows east. Jean-Pierre's coordinates for the logging camp are here." His finger landed on a spot about 30 kilometers downstream. "It's on the north bank. We'll have to cross the river to get to it." "There are patrols on the river," Anik whispered. "Jallo's men. They use motorboats." "I know," Brill said. "We'll travel at night. We'll stay close to the bank. We'll hide during the day." He looked at them, his eyes hard and cold. "It will take us 2 nights, maybe 3. We'll have to move fast. No stopping. No complaining. We drink from the river, and we eat what we can find. Or we don't eat at all." He was no longer the patient. He was the commander. This wasn't a request. It was an order. Rhodes stared at the map, at the impossible distance between their small, doomed clinic and the faint hope of the logging camp. He felt a wave of dizziness. I'm not sure I can do this." Brill looked up from the map. He stared at Rhodes, his gaze so intense it was like a physical blow. "You don't have a choice, Doctor," he said, his voice flat. "You made your choice when you didn't turn me over to the lieutenant. You made it again when you got on the radio. You're in this now. The only way out is forward." He folded the map and stuffed it into his pocket. He picked up a crowbar from a small toolkit in the corner. He walked to the front door and began to pry the hinges off the frame. The sound of splintering wood was the sound of their last bridge being burned. Anik watched him, her fear warring with a strange, grudging respect. This man was a force of nature. A hurricane in human form. He was destroying their world, but he was also the only one who seemed to know how to navigate the storm. She went to the supply room and came back with a handful of protein bars she had kept hidden for emergencies. She handed one to Brill. He took it without a word and shoved it into his pocket. She offered one to Rhodes. The old doctor just shook his head. The door came off its hinges with a final groaning crack. Brill and Anik dragged it into the center of the room. He began lashing the metal cot frame to it with strips of torn bedsheets, his knots swift and sure. An hour later, they had a raft. It was a crude, ugly thing, a clumsy marriage of wood and steel. It looked like it would sink in a bathtub. Brill stood back and looked at their creation. He knew it was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only gamble they had. He picked up one of the heavy duffel bags and slung it over his shoulder. He grabbed one of the alcohol-filled bottles and stuffed it into his belt. "It's time," he said. Rhodes looked around the main ward, at the empty shelves, the broken glass under the windows, the stripped-down cot frames. He saw the ghosts of 1,000 patients he had treated here. He had failed them all. Brill walked to the back door of the clinic, the one that led out toward the river. He put his hand on the knob. He looked back at Rhodes, who was still standing frozen in the middle of the room. "Doctor," Brill said, his voice sharp, impatient. "Now, Rhodes took one last look at his life's work. He turned his back on it. He picked up one of the duffel bags, the weight of his compromise settling onto his shoulders. Anik picked up another. They followed Brill to the door. Brill pushed it open. The jungle night rushed in, thick and black and filled with the sounds of things that hunted in the dark. He stepped out into it, and the others followed, leaving the empty clinic behind them, a hollowed-out monument to a war they had already lost. Chapter 15. Push. Brill's voice was a raw grunt in the darkness, lost under the groaning protest of wood and metal against mud. The makeshift raft was a clumsy beast, heavy and stubborn, and it didn't want to move. It was hung up on a tangle of roots at the river's edge. "I am pushing," Dr. Rhodes hissed back, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. His shoulder was jammed against the corner of the door raft, his worn leather shoes sinking into the slick mud of the riverbank. "It's not moving." "Then push harder." Brill was on the other side, submerged to his thighs in the black, sluggish water, his body a coiled spring of pure, desperate force. He had his back to the raft, his legs churning, trying to find purchase in the soft riverbed. The 4 heavy duffel bags of medicine were lashed to the center of the cot frame, a dead weight that threatened to sink them before they even started. Anik was in the middle, her hands flat against the cold metal, her face a mask of strained effort. She didn't speak. She just pushed, her slight frame trembling with the exertion. The jungle pressed in on them, a suffocating blanket of heat and noise. The air was thick with the smell of decay and wet earth. "Together," Brill commanded. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. They heaved, a collective agonized grunt. The raft scraped, shuddered, and then with a final, sucking lurch, it slid free of the roots and floated into the river. It wallowed, low in the water, the surface lapping just inches from the top of the door. But it floated. "Get on," Brill said, his voice urgent. He held the raft steady while Rhodes, clumsy with exhaustion, scrambled aboard, nearly tipping the whole thing over. The old doctor collapsed onto the metal cot frame, a heap of wet clothes and shallow breathing. Anik was next. She was more agile, moving with a practiced grace, distributing her weight carefully. She sat cross-legged beside Rhodes, her eyes wide as she stared into the impenetrable darkness of the river. Brill was the last to get on. He pushed the raft out into the current, then hauled himself over the side, dripping water and mud onto their precarious island. He lay flat on his stomach at the front of the door, using his hands as paddles to steer them away from the bank and into the main channel. The current caught them immediately, a slow, inexorable pull, drawing them east, away from the ruins of the clinic and deeper into the heart of a hostile country. The raft turned slowly, a lazy pirouette, as if uncertain of its new purpose. The river was a living thing. It whispered and gurgled around them. Things brushed against the bottom of the raft, branches or maybe things with scales and teeth. The jungle on either side was a solid wall of black, punctuated by the glowing eyes of nocturnal creatures. The air was alive with the chittering of insects, the croak of frogs, the distant mournful call of a night bird. Every sound was magnified in the darkness, every splash a potential threat. Rhodes began to shiver, a violent, uncontrollable trembling. It wasn't from the cold. It was the aftershock of adrenaline, the crushing weight of what he had done. He had abandoned his life's work. He had become a fugitive. "I can't believe this is happening," he mumbled, his voice a thin, reedy sound against the symphony of the jungle. "Believe it," Brill said from the front of the raft. He didn't look back. His attention was focused forward, his eyes scanning the black water, reading the subtle shifts in the current, looking for rocks and sandbars. "And be quiet." Sound travels on water. They drifted in silence for what felt like hours. The moon was a pale, broken sliver behind a thick blanket of clouds, offering no light. Their world was reduced to the small, unstable square of the raft, and the suffocating darkness around them. The heavy bags of medicine were a constant, silent presence in their midst, a reminder of the price of their passage. And then they heard it. A low, rhythmic thrumming. Faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the drone of the jungle. But it was growing louder. It was mechanical. And it was coming from behind them, upriver. "What is that?" Anique whispered, her voice tight with fear. Brill didn't have to answer. They all knew. A motor. A patrol boat. He was already paddling, his hands digging into the water, fighting the current, pushing them toward the southern bank. "Grab a branch," he hissed. "Help me steer." Anique reached over the side, her fingers searching in the dark water. She found a piece of driftwood and began to paddle, her movements frantic and clumsy. Rhodes, jolted from his stupor, did the same. The thrumming grew louder, a steady, predatory beat. It was moving fast. Faster than their clumsy raft. They were a snail, trying to outrun a cheetah. "In here," Brill commanded. He steered them toward a narrow inlet, where a curtain of thick hanging vines trailed into the water from the overhanging branches of a massive banyan tree. It was a dark, recessed space, a pocket of deeper shadow. They pushed the raft into the makeshift cave, the vines scraping against their faces, wet and cold and smelling of moss. Brill grabbed a handful of the thick, ropey strands and held them fast, anchoring their raft against the pull of the current. They were completely hidden from the main channel, swallowed by the jungle. The sound of the engine was on top of them now. A harsh, guttural roar that echoed off the water. A bright white light cut through the darkness, a single searching eye sweeping the riverbanks. The searchlight played across the water, then moved to the opposite bank, then back again. It moved slowly, methodically. The men on the boat were not in a hurry. They were hunters. Brill flattened himself on the raft, pulling Rhodes and Anique down with him. "Don't move," he breathed, his voice a ghost in the darkness. "Don't even breathe." The searchlight hit the curtain of vines in front of them. For a heart-stopping second, the light seemed to pause, to linger. Brill could see the individual leaves, the water droplets clinging to them like diamonds. He could hear the voices of the soldiers on the boat, speaking in a mix of French and a local dialect. They were close. So close he could smell the diesel fumes from their engine. He felt Anique tense beside him, her body rigid with terror. He reached out and put a hand on her shoulder, a firm, steady pressure. A silent command. "Stay calm." The light moved on. It swept past their hiding place and continued downriver. The sound of the engine began to fade, the thrumming growing fainter and fainter until it was once again swallowed by the sounds of the jungle. They waited in the silence for a full 5 minutes. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the frantic beating of their own hearts. Finally, Brill let out a slow, controlled breath. He released his grip on the vines. The current immediately began to pull them back out into the open. He didn't hesitate. He lay back on his stomach and began to paddle, his hands dipping into the black water, pulling them forward, pulling them east. Rhodes looked back upriver, into the darkness where the patrol boat had disappeared. "They'll be back," he whispered. "I know," Brill said, his voice a flat, cold statement of fact. He kept paddling, pushing their small, doomed island deeper into the night. Chapter 16. "You want us to pull it out of the water?" Dr. Rhodes's voice was a ragged whisper of disbelief. The first hint of dawn was bleeding through the jungle canopy, turning the oppressive blackness into a murky, featureless gray. The air was thick and steamy, already heavy with the day's heat. "It's not a request," Brill said. He was already in the waist-deep water, his hands finding purchase on the slimy underside of the door raft. "They'll look for it. They'll fly the river. If they see this thing, they'll see us." He didn't wait for an answer. He began to pull, his muscles straining against the dead weight of the raft and its precious heavy cargo. The thing was even more stubborn on land than it had been in the water. It was a lead anchor in a sea of mud. Anique slipped into the water beside him without a word. She found a handhold and pulled, her face set in a grim mask of determination. She understood the logic. She might not have liked it, but she understood it. Rhodes stood on the bank, watching them, his face a canvas of despair. He looked at his hands, soft and clean just days ago, now blistered and caked with mud. He was a doctor. A man of intellect. He wasn't made for this. "Doctor," Brill's voice cut through his thoughts sharp as a shard of glass. "Get over here." Rhodes stumbled into the water, the cold shock of it doing nothing to wake him from his waking nightmare. He put his shoulder to the raft and pushed, his movements feeble and uncoordinated. It took them nearly an hour to drag the raft 20 feet inland, into a thick tangled grove of mangrove trees whose roots clawed at the air like skeletal fingers. The work was brutal, punishing. Every inch was a victory paid for in sweat and strained muscles and curses muttered under the breath. When they were done, they collapsed in the mud, gasping for air. The raft was hidden, tucked away under a low-hanging curtain of leaves and vines. You wouldn't see it unless you were standing 10 feet away. Brill was the first to move. He was already scanning their surroundings, his eyes missing nothing. The grove was a fetid, miserable place. The ground was a soup of mud and rotting leaves. The air was thick with mosquitoes, a high-pitched, whining cloud that descended on them immediately. The smell was overpowering, a rich, cloying odor of decay. It was the perfect place to hide. No one would come here unless they had to. "This is our home for the next 12 hours, Brill announced, his voice flat. He pulled the small, worn map from his pocket. It was damp, but still readable. He studied it for a moment, then pointed. "We made maybe 10 kilometers last night. We have 20 to go. We'll do another 10 tonight." "We'll be dead by then," Rhodes mumbled, slapping at a mosquito on his cheek. He left a smear of blood. "Maybe," Brill said. "But we'll be dead here if we don't move." He took one of the protein bars from his pocket, broke off a small piece, and handed it to Rhodes. He gave another piece to Anique. He saved the smallest piece for himself. "Eat slowly. It's all you get until tonight." Anique nibbled at her piece, her eyes darting around the mangrove grove, at the strange twisted shapes of the roots, the deep impenetrable shadows. "What about animals?" she asked, her voice low. "Snakes?" "They live here," Brill said. "We're just visiting. Don't step on them, they won't step on you." He didn't sound convincing. He knew as well as she did that the jungle was not a place of mutual respect. It was a place of predator and prey. Right now, they were the prey. The day dragged on, a long, slow torture. The heat became oppressive, a physical weight that pressed down on them, stealing their breath. The mosquito whine was a constant, maddening soundtrack. They huddled in the shade of the mangroves, their bodies slick with sweat, their clothes stiff with dried mud. Rhodes was deteriorating. He would sit in silence for long stretches, staring into nothing, his lips moving in a silent, frantic monologue. Then he would be seized by a fit of shivering, his teeth chattering despite the suffocating heat. He kept touching his pockets, a phantom gesture, searching for the stethoscope and prescription pad that were no longer there. Brill watched him, his expression unreadable. He saw a man coming apart at the seams. A liability. But also a necessary piece of the puzzle. He needed the doctor to make the final trade with Jean-Pierre. A dead doctor was worthless. Around midday, they heard the boat again. The same rhythmic thrumming of the engine, but this time it was closer. It was moving slowly, methodically searching the riverbanks. Brill put a finger to his lips, a silent command they didn't need. They were already frozen, a tableau of terrified statues in the sweltering heat. The sound grew louder, louder, until it was right on top of them. They could hear the soldiers talking again, their voices carrying clearly over the water. They were arguing about something, their words sharp and angry. Brill risked a look through the curtain of leaves. He saw the patrol boat, a green, ugly scar on the brown water. There were 4 soldiers on board. One of them was pointing toward their side of the river. He seemed to be gesturing at the very grove where they were hiding. Brill's hand went to the knife on his belt. His body coiled, ready to move. He was no longer thinking about escape. He was thinking about how many he could take with him. The boat drifted closer. Close enough that Brill could see the bored, sullen look on the face of the man at the helm. Close enough to see the glint of the sun on the barrel of the heavy machine gun mounted on the bow. Then, the argument on the boat seemed to resolve itself. The man who had been pointing shrugged and sat down. The boat's engine roared to life, and it pulled away, continuing its slow, methodical search downriver. They didn't move for a long time after it was gone. The silence it left behind was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was a silence filled with the knowledge of how close they had come. Anik let out a long, shuddering breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Brill. He was still watching the river, his eyes narrowed, his face a mask of cold concentration. He hadn't been afraid. He had been calculating. As the afternoon wore on, Rhodes's condition worsened. He began to talk to himself, his voice a low, rambling mumble. He was talking to his wife, who had died 10 years ago. He was apologizing to her. Brill let him ramble. It was better than screaming. Finally, the sun began to sink, the oppressive heat of the day giving way to the cool, damp air of the evening. The shadows lengthened, and the jungle began to wake up around them, the chorus of nocturnal creatures starting their nightly symphony. Brill stood up. He stretched, his joints popping. He looked down at his 2 companions. They were a pathetic sight. A broken old man and a terrified young woman. This was his army. He walked over to the raft. He untied the lashings on one of the duffel bags. He took out one of the bottles of rubbing alcohol. He pulled the bandage wick from the top. He walked back to Rhodes and handed him the open bottle. "Drink," he said. Rhodes looked at the bottle, then at Brill, his eyes filled with confusion. "It's poison." "It's antiseptic," Brill corrected. "It'll clean you out. And it'll keep you warm." He nudged the bottle toward the doctor's lips. "Drink it. That's an order." Rhodes hesitated, then took the bottle. He took a small tentative sip, then coughed, his whole body shaking. But he took another, larger swallow. Brill took the bottle back and offered it to Anik. She shook her head, her eyes wide with disgust. He shrugged and took a long swallow himself. The alcohol burned a hot trail down his throat and into his stomach. It was a clean, sharp fire. It was the fire of survival. He screwed the cap back on the bottle and put it away. He looked up at the sky. It was almost dark enough. He walked back to the raft and grabbed the edge of it. He looked at Rhodes and Anik. "On your feet," he said, his voice a low, hard command that cut through the jungle night. "The river is waiting." Chapter 17. Is he breathing? Anik's question was a wisp of sound, swallowed by the river's gurgle and the incessant, maddening buzz of insects. She was huddled in the center of the raft, her arms wrapped around Dr. Rhodes's thin shoulders, trying to shield him from a chill that wasn't there. "He's breathing," Brill said from the front of the raft. He didn't look back. His eyes were fixed on the black water ahead. "He's drunk. There's a difference." The second night on the river was worse than the first. The darkness felt heavier, the air thicker. Rhodes had taken to the rubbing alcohol with a grim sort of thirst, and now he was a dead weight, mumbling in a fitful, feverish sleep. The single protein bar and the burn of cheap antiseptic had done little to restore him. Brill's arms ached, a deep burning fire in his shoulders and back. He'd been paddling for hours, his hands raw from the splintered wood of the makeshift oar he'd fashioned. The current was their friend and their enemy, pulling them toward their destination, but also threatening to smash them against unseen obstacles in the dark. A snake, thick as a man's arm, dropped from an overhanging branch and hit the water with a loud plop just feet from the raft. Anik flinched, a small strangled gasp escaping her lips. Brill didn't react. He just kept paddling. "It's not interested in you," he said, his voice a low monotone. "We're too big to eat." "That's supposed to be comforting," she whispered back, her voice trembling. "It's a fact," he said. "Facts are better than comfort. Comfort gets you killed." He felt the raft scrape against something underwater, a hard, grating sound that vibrated through the wood. He swore under his breath and pushed them off it, steering them back toward the center of the channel. The raft was a clumsy, waterlogged pig, and it was getting heavier, the wood saturated, the cot frames seeming to pull them down. He risked a look at the map, shielding his small flashlight with his body to cast a dim, downward glow. They were close. Maybe another 5 kilometers. They could make it before dawn. If their luck held. His luck never held. He heard the engine first. It wasn't the slow, methodical thrum of the patrol boat from before. This was different. A high-pitched, angry whine. 2 engines, not 1. And they were coming fast. Not searching. Hunting. "Wake him up," Brill hissed, his voice ablaze in the darkness. Anik shook Rhodes, her hands patting his face. Doctor, wake up. They're coming." Rhodes groaned, his eyes fluttering open. They were glassy, unfocused. "Mary," he mumbled. "Is that you?" "It's not Mary," Brill said, his voice cutting through the old man's alcoholic fog. He was already untying one of the medical bags, his fingers working quickly at the wet knots. "It's the men who want to kill you. On your feet. Get ready to swim." He pulled one of the bottles of alcohol from the bag. He checked the bandage wick, making sure it was secure. He had 2 more in another bag. 3 chances. Against 2 boats. The odds stank. The whine of the engines grew into a roar. Lights appeared upriver, 2 bright stabbing beams cutting through the night, bouncing on the choppy water. They were moving at full throttle, converging on their position. There was no time to hide. No mangrove grove to slip into. They were caught in the open, a single dark shape on a black river. "They saw us," Anik breathed, her voice filled with a terrible final certainty. "They haven't seen us yet," Brill corrected. "They just know where we are." The first boat was 100 yards out when the flare went up. It shot into the sky with a loud whoosh and exploded, bathing the river in a harsh chemical white light. They were exposed, caught in the stark artificial daylight. The raft, the 3 of them, the heavy bags of medicine, all of it laid bare for the hunters. Brill saw the figures in the boats now. 4 men in each. They wore the black uniforms of Jallo's elite guard. They held assault rifles. One man in the lead boat raised his weapon. Brill didn't hesitate. He pulled a lighter from his pocket, a cheap plastic thing he'd taken from the dead guard at the compound, and sparked it to life. The small flame flickered, fragile and precious. He touched it to the bandage wick. The wick caught, a small sputtering orange flower. He stood up on the unsteady raft, a perfect target in the ghostly white light of the flare. He balanced himself, his legs bent, his body a coiled spring. The lead boat was 50 yards out and closing fast. He could see the muzzle flash from the first rifle. He swung his arm back and threw. The bottle sailed through the air, a small dark comet with a tail of fire. It was a perfect throw. It smashed against the side of the lead boat, just above the waterline. For a second, nothing happened. Then the world erupted in a ball of orange and red. The rubbing alcohol, atomized by the impact, ignited with a furious whooshing roar. A sheet of liquid fire washed over the boat, clinging to the hull, the deck, the men. Screams tore through the night. Sharp, high-pitched, inhuman sounds of men being burned alive. The boat veered sharply, out of control, its engine sputtering as the flames found the fuel line. Two of the figures, their bodies wreathed in fire, leaped into the river, their screams abruptly silenced by the water. The second boat slowed, its occupants momentarily stunned by the sudden, fiery chaos. That was the opening Brill needed. "Paddle?" he roared, dropping to his stomach and digging his oar into the water. "To the bank. Now." Bullets stitched the water around them, angry wasps whining past their ears. The flare was dying, its harsh white light fading back to a deep, bloody red before extinguishing, plunging them back into darkness. The only light now was the hellish, flickering glow from the burning boat. The raft lurched, a hard, splintering impact throwing them forward. A line of bullet holes had torn through the wood. Water was pouring in, no longer just seeping, but gushing. "We're sinking," Rhodes cried, his voice a thin, terrified wail. "Then swim faster," Brill grunted, pushing them forward with every ounce of his strength. Another burst of gunfire ripped through the night. Brill felt a sharp, burning pain in his side as a bullet tore through one of the duffel bags and grazed his ribs. The bag sagged, its contents, hundreds of vials of precious antibiotics, spilling out into the dark water, a fortune sinking into the mud. He ignored the pain. The bank was 20 feet away. 10 feet. The second boat was coming on again, its searchlight cutting through the smoke from the burning wreck, hunting for them. They hit the bank hard, the impact jarring, final. The raft, already crippled, broke apart, the cot frame separating from the door, the lashings snapping. The remaining bags of medicine slid into the river. Brill was thrown into the water, the cold shock of it taking his breath away. He went under, the current pulling at him, tangling him in the roots of a submerged tree. He kicked, fought his way to the surface, gasping for air. The searchlight swept over him, blinding him. He heard shouting from the boat. They had him. He took a final, deep breath and let himself sink back under the water, the darkness and the river closing over his head like a grave. Chapter 18. The world underwater was a nightmare of brown noise and pressure. The river squeezed Brill's head, a dull, thudding vice grip. The sound of the boat's engine was a distorted, grinding roar that vibrated through his bones. Above him, the searchlight was a milky, diffuse patch of white, a malevolent god eye trying to pierce the murk. His lungs were on fire. He clawed at the riverbed, his fingers digging into a tangle of submerged roots. The current was a physical force, trying to tear him away, to tumble him downstream like a loose stone. He held on, his muscles screaming, his vision starting to tunnel into a tight black circle. The boat passed directly over him. The hull was a huge, dark shadow that blotted out the light. The vibration was intense, a violent shudder that seemed to shake the teeth in his skull. He could hear the soldiers shouting, their voices muffled and alien. He needed air. Now. He pulled himself along the network of roots, staying close to the bank, moving with a desperate, burning urgency. He let the current help him, using it, guiding himself through the black water. Another 10 feet. Another 20. His body was screaming for release. The fire in his chest was an inferno. He was out of time. He broke the surface with a convulsive, silent gasp, his mouth opening to suck in the thick, humid night air. He was 50 yards downstream from the chaos. The burning boat was a funeral pyre in the middle of the river, casting long, dancing shadows, its light a hellish orange glow against the black curtain of the jungle. Thick, oily smoke billowed into the sky, carrying the sickeningly sweet smell of burning plastic and roasted meat. He trod water for a moment, getting his bearings. The second boat was idling near the wreck. Soldiers were using long hooks to pull things from the water. Bodies. He turned his attention to the bank. It was a steep, muddy incline, slick with rot. He scanned the tree line, the deep, impenetrable shadows. Nothing. He swam toward the bank, his movements slow and economical, creating barely a ripple. His side throbbed, a dull, insistent ache. The bullet graze. He'd deal with it later. He found them huddled at the base of a giant kapok tree, its roots like the gnarled fingers of a buried giant. They were 20 feet from the water's edge, pressed into the mud as if trying to merge with the earth itself. Anik saw him first. Her eyes went wide, a mixture of terror and disbelief. She looked like she was seeing a ghost rising from a watery grave. She put a hand to her mouth to stifle a cry. Rhodes was a wreck. He was on his hands and knees, shivering uncontrollably, his head bowed. He was retching, bringing up nothing but bile and cheap alcohol. Brill crawled the last few feet and collapsed beside them, his chest heaving. He lay in the mud, the cool filth a strange comfort against his skin. He didn't speak. He just listened. The soldiers on the boat were still shouting. Their voices were angry, frustrated. They had lost men. They had lost face. Now they wanted blood. The searchlight from their boat began to sweep the banks again, more methodically this time. The beam cut a sharp, white swath through the darkness, inching its way toward them. "We have to move," Brill rasped, his voice raw. Anik shook her head, her eyes still locked on the approaching light. "Where?" "There's nowhere to go." "There's always somewhere," he said. He pushed himself up, ignoring the flare of pain in his side. The medicine. The bags. Did any of them make it to the shore? She looked at him, her expression blank, then her eyes filled with a fresh wave of despair. "They're gone," she whispered. "All of them. I saw them sink. When the raft broke." Brill nodded slowly. He had known, but he had to hear it. A fortune in antibiotics, their only bargaining chip, was now at the bottom of the river. The currency was gone. The searchlight was getting closer. It illuminated a patch of jungle, 50 feet to their left. It was moving with a slow, inexorable patience. Brill grabbed Rhodes by the collar of his shirt and hauled him to his feet. The old man was limp, a dead weight. "Doctor," Brill said, his voice low and hard. "Get up. Now." Rhodes stumbled, his eyes unfocused. "It's over," he mumbled. "We're finished." "It's not over until you stop breathing," Brill said. He gave the doctor a rough shake. "Listen to me. The medicine is gone. You understand? It's gone." Rhodes stared at him, the words slowly penetrating his alcoholic fog. "But Jean-Pierre." "Jean-Pierre still wants a doctor," Brill said. "He doesn't care about the medicine. Not as much as he cares about keeping his men alive. You are the currency now. Your life is what we're trading. So you are going to walk out of here." The searchlight hit the tree just above their heads. They were plunged into a stark white glare, pinned like insects on a board. Brill shoved Anik and Rhodes behind the massive trunk, shielding them with his own body. They waited, their breath held, for the inevitable burst of gunfire. It didn't come. The light lingered for a moment, then moved on, continuing its slow sweep down the riverbank. They were hidden by the deep shadows at the base of the tree. For now. "They'll come back," Anik whispered, her voice trembling. "At dawn, they'll search the banks on foot." "Then we won't be here at dawn," Brill said. He looked away from the river, into the jungle. It was a solid wall of blackness, a place of unseen things, of thorns and fangs and things that slithered in the dark. It was their only option. He checked the small, cheap compass he'd taken from the dead guard. East. They had to keep moving east. Away from the river, away from the boats, toward the rumor of a town called Bafouébal and a gunrunner named Jean-Pierre. He pulled a strip of cloth from the bottom of his torn shirt and tied it tightly around his side, a makeshift bandage for the bullet graze. It would have to do. He turned to his two companions. One was a drunk, broken old man. The other was a terrified nurse who was in way over her head. They were his responsibility, his assets, his liabilities. The river was the easy part, he said, his voice flat, devoid of any hope or comfort. It was just a statement of fact. He took a step, pushing aside a thick, leafy branch that blocked their path. The darkness beyond it was absolute. It was like stepping off the edge of the world. "Come on," he said, not looking back to see if they were following. He pushed his way into the suffocating, living darkness of the jungle. Chapter 19. Did you hear that? Anik's voice was a dry crackle, barely a whisper. She was frozen mid-step, one foot hovering over a slick black root. Her face, streaked with mud and sweat, was a mask of animal alertness. Brill didn't stop. He didn't even look back. He took another step, pushing aside a thick, waxy leaf that dripped foul-smelling water onto his shoulder. "I hear a million things," he said, his voice a low grunt of exertion. "Half of them want to eat you. Keep moving." The jungle was a physical presence. It wasn't just around them, it was on them. The air was a wet, heavy blanket they had to force their way through. The ground was a treacherous soup of mud and grasping roots. Thorns, sharp as needles, tore at their clothes and skin, leaving a crisscross of angry red scratches. The noise was constant, a symphony of the damned, the high-pitched whine of mosquitoes, the guttural croak of unseen frogs, the rustle and skitter of things moving just beyond the weak beam of Brill's flashlight. They had been walking for 6 hours. Or maybe 10. Time had lost its meaning, measured now only in the burn of their muscles and the throb of their feet. Dr. Rhodes stumbled again, his foot catching on a vine. He went down hard, a dead weight, landing with a wet smack in the mud. He didn't even try to break his fall. He just lay there, a discarded sack of bones. "I can't," he wheezed, his voice bubbling with exhaustion and despair. "Leave me. Just leave me here." Brill stopped and turned, his flashlight beam pinning the old man to the ground. Rhodes looked pathetic, a creature of the mud, his fine doctor's hands caked in filth. The last of the alcohol had sweated out of him hours ago, leaving him with a skull-splitting headache and a case of the shakes that had nothing to do with the cold. "Get up, doctor," Brill said. His voice was flat, devoid of sympathy. "No." Rhodes's voice was a petulant whine. "I'm done. Finished. You can't make me." Brill walked back and stood over him. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't say a word of encouragement. He just looked down at him, his shadow falling over the old man like a shroud. "You're right," Brill said, his voice quiet. "I can't make you." He turned to Anik. "Give me your belt." She looked at him, her eyes wide with confusion and a flicker of fear. "What for?" "I'm going to tie his hands," Brill said, as if explaining the most obvious thing in the world. "Then I'm going to drag him." Rhodes's head snapped up, his eyes widening in the flashlight beam. "You wouldn't." "I need a doctor in Bathwable," Brill said. "I don't need him conscious." He held his hand out to Anik. "The belt." The bluff worked. The thought of being dragged through the jungle like a carcass, his face scraping over rocks and roots, was enough to rekindle a tiny spark of will in the old man. With a groan that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, Rhodes began to push himself up. Anik rushed to his side, helping him to his feet. He leaned on her heavily, his body trembling, but he was standing. They kept moving. Brill set a brutal, relentless pace. He was a machine, his body fueled by a cold, hard purpose that burned away fatigue and pain. The bullet graze in his side was a hot, angry knot, but he walled it off, filed it away. It was just another piece of data, an inconvenience to be dealt with later. Anik watched him, her fear slowly being replaced by a kind of grudging awe. He wasn't just surviving. He was functioning. He navigated the trackless jungle as if he had a map tattooed on the inside of his skull. He saw things she didn't: a broken branch, a patch of disturbed earth, a subtle change in the sound of the night, and adjusted their course without a word. He was more animal than man, something that belonged in this green hell. She was starting to understand that he wasn't leading them through the jungle. He was leading them with it. After what felt like an eternity, the terrain began to change. The ground became firmer, the trees less dense. And then, a miracle. A trail. It was barely a path, a thin ribbon of packed earth snaking through the undergrowth. But it was man-made. It meant they weren't the only ones who had ever walked here. Rhodes saw it first. "A path," he cried, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic hope. "We're saved." He lurched forward, but Brill's arm shot out, barring his way. "Stay off it," Brill commanded. "What?" Rhodes stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief. "But it's a path. It will lead us somewhere." "That's the problem," Brill said. He knelt, his fingers tracing the edge of the trail. He was looking at something, a faint impression in the dirt. A footprint. Barefoot. Recent. A path means people. People mean questions. We don't have good answers. He stood up and looked down the trail, his eyes narrowed, his senses on high alert. The jungle had been a neutral enemy. It didn't care if they lived or died. But a person would care. A person would have an opinion. And in this country, that opinion was likely to be fatal. "We follow it," Brill said. "But we don't walk on it. We stay in the trees, 10 feet to the side. It's slower, but it's safer." It was a new kind of torture. They had to fight their way through the undergrowth, always keeping the tantalizingly easy path in sight. It was a constant reminder of how hard their journey was. They followed the ghost of the trail for another hour. The moon broke through the clouds, filtering through the canopy in pale ghostly shafts of light. And then Brill stopped. He didn't make a sound. He just froze, his body going rigid, his head cocked to one side. He held up a hand, a silent command for them to do the same. Anik strained her ears, listening. At first, she heard nothing but the familiar chorus of the jungle. Then she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A sharp snap, like a dry twig breaking under a heavy foot. It came from up ahead, somewhere along the trail. Brill moved with a silent, fluid grace that was terrifying to watch. He pushed Rhodes and Anik behind the thick, gnarled trunk of an ironwood tree. He put a finger to his lips, his eyes boring into theirs, conveying a message of absolute silence. He drew the knife from his belt. The blade didn't gleam in the moonlight. Its surface was dull, non-reflective. A tool made for one purpose. He flattened himself against the trunk of the tree, peering around the edge, his body perfectly still. He was no longer a man. He was a predator, scenting the air, waiting for his prey to reveal itself. He was part of the jungle now, another shadow in a world of shadows, waiting to see what was coming for them down the path. Chapter 20. They are close. The voice was a low rumble, more a vibration in the chest than a sound. It came from the shadows on the other side of the trail. Brill didn't move. He didn't breathe. He pressed himself flatter against the ironwood, the rough bark digging into his cheek. The knife in his hand was an extension of his will, steady and cold. Another voice answered, this one younger, sharper. "How many?" "2. Maybe 3. They move like city people." Loud. A soft chuckle. "Good. City people carry things." Brill processed the exchange. It was in Lingala, a trader's language. Poachers, not soldiers. That was good news and bad news. Soldiers would kill them because of who they were. Poachers would kill them for what they had. Or what they thought they had. He risked a glance around the edge of the tree. The moonlight was a treacherous, shifting thing, but he caught a flicker of movement. Two figures stepped onto the path, emerging from the deep black of the opposite tree line. They were shadows made flesh. Both were tall and wiry, their skin the color of dark river mud. They wore tattered shorts and nothing else, their chests and arms a roadmap of old scars. They moved with the silent, predatory grace of leopards. One carried a long, ancient-looking rifle. The other held a machete, the blade honed to a razor's edge. They weren't soldiers, but they were just as deadly. The one with the rifle sniffed the air, his head turning slowly. "I smell medicine. Antiseptic." He grinned, a flash of white teeth in the gloom. "And fear. My favorite combination." Brill's mind was racing. They were downwind. The poachers had smelled the alcohol Rhodes had been drinking, the faint scent still clinging to his clothes. They had smelled their sweat. They were prey. He looked at Rhodes and Anik, hidden behind him. Their eyes were wide, luminous with terror. They were looking to him, expecting a plan, a miracle. He had no miracle. Just a knife. Against a rifle and a machete. The odds were long. But he'd faced longer. The two poachers began to move again, stepping off the path, coming directly toward their hiding place. They knew. The snap of the twig hadn't been an accident. It had been a test. They had thrown a stone into the pond, and were waiting to see what ripples it made. Brill made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for them to find him. He was going to meet them. He took a deep, silent breath and stepped out from behind the tree. He didn't raise the knife. He didn't assume a threatening posture. He just appeared, a third shadow in the moonlight, standing between the poachers and his companions. The two men froze. Their reaction was instantaneous, a masterclass in jungle survival. The one with the rifle brought the weapon up to his shoulder, the barrel pointing directly at Brill's chest. The one with the machete crouched low, the blade held ready. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the incessant hum of the jungle. "You are lost," the rifleman said. It wasn't a question. Brill nodded slowly. He kept his hands open, away from his body. The knife was still in his right hand, but he held it loosely, the blade pointing down. Not a threat. Not yet. "We are looking for Bafwebull," Brill said, his lingala rusty but serviceable. The rifleman's eyes narrowed. "Bafwebull is far. And the road is dangerous. Especially for men who carry the scent of a hospital." He gestured with the rifle barrel. "Where are your bags?" "Lost," Brill said. "In the river." The poacher with the machete let out a short, harsh laugh. A likely story. He took a step closer, his eyes raking over Brill, then peering into the shadows behind him. He saw Anik and Rhodes. His grin widened. "You have a woman. And an old man. They look soft. Soft people have soft things." "We have nothing," Brill said, his voice level. "We are travelers who had bad luck." "Everyone in this jungle has bad luck," the rifleman said. "Our luck is about to change." He was going to shoot. Brill could see it in the tightening of his finger on the trigger, the slight shift in his stance. He was tensing for the recoil. Brill moved. He didn't go forward. He went down. He dropped to one knee, a sudden, unexpected movement that took him out of the rifle's line of sight. At the same time, he flicked his wrist, throwing the knife. It wasn't a killing throw. It was a distraction. The knife wasn't aimed at the man. It was aimed at the rifle. The blade hit the wooden stock of the rifle with a loud thwack. It wasn't enough to damage the weapon, but it was enough to jar the poacher's aim. His shot went wide, the muzzle flash a brilliant blinding orange, the report a deafening crack that echoed through the jungle. The bullet tore through the leaves just inches from where Brill's head had been. In the split second of the rifleman's surprise, Brill was moving again. He launched himself forward, a low, driving tackle aimed at the man's legs. He hit him hard, wrapping his arms around his knees, driving him backward. The rifleman went down with a grunt, the rifle flying from his grasp. It clattered against a rock and slid into the undergrowth. The second poacher, the one with the machete, was already on him. He came in fast, the long blade whistling through the air in a vicious, horizontal slash aimed at Brill's head. Brill rolled, the machete slicing through the air where he had been a moment before. He came up inside the man's guard, too close for the long blade to be effective. He drove his shoulder into the poacher's chest, knocking him off balance. He grabbed the man's wrist with both hands, twisting, using the man's own momentum against him. There was a sickening crunch of bone. The poacher screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. The machete fell from his nerveless fingers. Brill didn't let go. He kept twisting, using the pain as a lever. He spun the man around, putting him between himself and the first poacher, who was scrambling for his rifle. "Don't move," Brill hissed in the man's ear, his voice a cold whisper of death. The first poacher froze, his hand hovering over the rifle. He looked at his partner, saw the unnatural angle of his arm, the white-hot agony in his eyes. Brill kept the pressure on the broken wrist. The man was a shield, a human barricade. "You are fast," the rifleman said, his voice a low growl of grudging respect. "For a city man." "I'm a fast learner," Brill said. He looked at the rifle, then back at the poacher. "Kick it away." The man hesitated. The rifle was his life, his power. Brill gave the broken wrist another sharp, brutal twist. The poacher in his grasp screamed again, his body going limp. "Kick it away," Brill repeated, his voice like ice. With a snarl of frustration, the rifleman kicked the weapon. It slid deeper into the darkness of the jungle floor. "Now," Brill said, his voice dropping even lower, "we are going to have a conversation. About Bafwable. About a man named Jean-Pierre. And you are going to tell me everything I want to know. Or your friend is going to learn how many ways a man can scream." He tightened his grip one last time, and the jungle night was filled with the sound of a man begging for his life. Chapter 21. "His name is MBE, the rifleman said, his voice a low, defeated rasp. He didn't look at his partner, the man Brill held as a shield, whose whimpers were a constant wet counterpoint to the jungle's hum. "The man you are hurting. I am Cassie." "I don't care about your names," Brill said, his voice a cold, flat line. He kept the pressure on the broken wrist, a precise application of leverage and pain. "I care about Bafwable. I care about a man named Jean-Pierre." Cassie's eyes, dark pools in the moonlight, flickered with a new kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of a knife or a broken bone. It was the fear of a name. "Jean-Pierre is not a man you look for," he said. "He is a man you run from." "I'm not running," Brill said. "I'm buying passage. I need a boat. Down river. All the way to the coast." Cassie let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "A boat from Jean-Pierre? You would have better luck asking a crocodile to carry you on its back. He owns Bafwable. The river, the town, the people. He doesn't sell passage. He sells flesh. He sells weapons. He sells misery." "I have a doctor," Brill said, nodding toward the shadows where Rhodes and Anik were pressed against the tree. "A good one. His skills are for sale." Cassie's gaze shifted to Rhodes, a long, calculating look. "A doctor is useful. But Jean-Pierre has his own kind of medicine. Usually, it comes from the barrel of a gun." He looked back at Brill. "He will take your doctor." He will take your woman, and he will feed you to the river. That is his way. Then you're going to show me a new way, Brill said. He retrieved his knife, wiping the mud from the blade on his trousers before tucking it back into his belt. He shoved MBE toward Cassie. The man stumbled, cradling his shattered wrist, his face a mask of agony. You're taking us to Bafwable. No, Cassie said, shaking his head. It is suicide. It's a job, Brill corrected him. You're my guide. You get us there. I let you and your friend live. You try to run, you try to trick me. He dies first. Brill's eyes flicked to MBE. Then you die. Slowly. Cassie looked at MBE, then at the impenetrable darkness of the jungle around them, then back at the stranger who had appeared out of the night like a vengeful spirit. He was trapped. He nodded once, a sharp, bitter gesture of surrender. I am your guide. Anik stepped forward, her professional instincts overriding her fear. She looked at Emby's arm, the unnatural angle of the bone beneath the skin. His wrist, it needs to be set. If we don't, he could lose the hand. Brill looked at her, then at MBE, who was now slumped against a tree, his breathing shallow and rapid. A liability. But a useful one. Do it, he said. What followed was a grotesque parody of a field hospital. Anik, her hands trembling but her voice steady, directed Rhodes. The old doctor, his own fear a palpable thing, fumbled through the motions, his hands shaking almost as much as his patience. They found a straight, sturdy branch. Anik tore strips from her own shirt to use as bindings. Brill stood guard, his attention divided between his new prisoners and the surrounding jungle. He didn't trust Cassie for a second. The man was a survivor. Survivors were patient. They waited for their opportunity. The sound of the bone setting was a wet, sickening crack, followed by a choked, strangled scream from MBE. Then, blessed silence, broken only by the man's ragged, painful sobs. It is done, Anik said, her face pale in the gloom. Good, Brill said. Let's move. They started walking again, a bizarre, miserable procession. Cassie in the lead, Brill right behind him, close enough to smell his sweat, close enough to put a knife in his kidney if he made a wrong move. MBE stumbled between Rhodes and Anik, who supported him, half carrying the dead weight of the injured man. The jungle was different now. Before, it had been an impartial enemy. Now, with Cassie as a guide, it became a landscape of specific personal threats. Wait, Cassie would hiss, holding up a hand. He'd point with his chin at a patch of innocent-looking leaves. Gaboon viper. You step there, you are dead in 5 minutes. A little later, he'd stop them again, pointing to a thin, almost invisible vine stretched across the path at ankle height. Tripwire. Not for a gun. For a snare. It would take your leg off. He was proving his worth. He was also showing off, a subtle power play. You may have a knife, his actions said, but I have the knowledge. You need me. Brill let him have his small victories. It kept him cooperative. They walked for hours, a journey through a green living hell. The humidity was a physical weight. The insects were a constant torment. Emby's whimpers became a monotonous, rhythmic sound that grated on their nerves. Finally, just as the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, Cassie stopped. He pointed through a gap in the trees. There, he said. My camp. Brill peered through the gap. In a small, natural clearing, about 100 yards ahead, he saw the flicker of a dying fire. A makeshift shelter, built from branches and broad leaves, leaned against a rock face. It was a squalid, temporary home, the kind of place men used when they were on the run or on the hunt. What's there? Brill asked, his voice a low whisper. Water, Cassie said. A little food. Smoked meat. And the rifle. His eyes lingered on the camp, a flicker of longing in their depths. The rifle was his power, his identity. He was naked without it. Brill understood. He needed that rifle. His knife was a weapon of desperation. A rifle was a weapon of control. Who else is there? Brill asked. No one, Cassie said. Just the two of us. We hunt for a week, then take the meat to Bafwayble to trade. We're going to your camp, Brill said. We'll get the rifle, get some water. And you are going to stay very quiet. You make one sound I don't like, one move I don't expect, and MBE will pay for it. Understand? Cassie nodded, his eyes sullen. Brill turned to Rhodes and Anik. You two stay here with him, he said, gesturing to MBE. Don't move. Don't make a sound. He pushed Cassie forward, out of the dense undergrowth and into the more open woodland that surrounded the clearing. They moved like ghosts, their feet making no sound on the damp earth. The camp was silent, the dying fire casting a faint reddish glow. The rifle was leaning against the rock face, next to the entrance of the shelter. It was an old bolt-action, a relic from some long-forgotten war, but in this world it was a king's scepter. They were 20 yards away when a figure emerged from the shelter. Not a man. A boy. He couldn't have been more than 12 years old. He was rail-thin, wearing the same tattered shorts as the men. He stretched, scratching his stomach, then walked over to the fire and poked at it with a stick. Cassie froze, a strangled sound catching in his throat. Brill's hand shot out, grabbing a fistful of Cassie's shirt, pulling him back into the shadows. You said you were alone, Brill hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. He is my son, Cassie choked out, his eyes wide with a new, frantic terror. He watches the camp when we hunt. I did not think. Brill looked from the terrified father to the boy by the fire. A complication. A witness. A loose end. The boy turned, his eyes scanning the tree line, a small, curious frown on his face. He had heard something. A whisper. A rustle of leaves. Brill tightened his grip on Cassie's shirt, pulling him deeper into the shadows, his mind racing, calculating the new, deadly geometry of the situation. The boy was looking directly at them now, his head cocked, his hand reaching for the rifle. Chapter 22. Father. The boy's voice was a thin, high-pitched question mark in the gray pre-dawn light. His hand was on the rifle now, his small fingers wrapped around the stock. He wasn't pointing it. Not yet. He was just holding it, the way a child holds a talisman against the dark. Cassie made a sound, a strangled, desperate noise deep in his throat. It was the sound of a trapped animal, seeing its young wander into the snare. Brill didn't give him time to think. He didn't give the boy time to get brave. He moved. He shoved Cassie out of the shadows and into the clearing. Call him off, Brill hissed, his voice a low, urgent command right behind Cassie's ear. Cassie stumbled forward, his hands raised, palms out. Teke, my son. It is all right. Do not touch the gun. The boy Teke stared, his eyes wide, first at his father, then at the pale stranger who emerged from the trees behind him like a bad spirit. His knuckles went white on the rifle stock. Who is he? Teke asked, his voice trembling but defiant. He is a traveler, Cassie said, picking his words carefully. We are guiding him. Brill walked past Cassie, his steps slow and deliberate, his eyes locked on the boy. He didn't look at the rifle. He looked at Teke's face. He wasn't a threat. He was a man walking through a camp. Your father is a good guide, Brill said, his voice calm, almost conversational. He stopped about 10 feet from the boy. But he forgot to mention you. Teke swallowed hard. He was trying to be brave, trying to puff out his chest and stand his ground like the men he emulated. But he was just a child, and the man walking toward him was something he had never seen before. Something cold and still and dangerous. I watched the camp, Teke said, his voice a little shaky. I can see that, Brill said. He nodded toward the rifle. Do you know how to use it? Yes, Teke said, a little too quickly. My father taught me. Did he teach you what happens when you point it at the wrong person? Brill took another step. He was close enough now to see the dirt under the boy's fingernails, the mosquito bite on his cheek. Sometimes they take it from you. Before Teke could react, Brill's hand shot out. It wasn't a grab. It was a fluid, precise movement. His fingers closed over the rifle barrel, his thumb pressing down on the bolt. At the same time, his other hand took hold of the stock. He didn't wrench it away. He just applied pressure, a firm, undeniable leverage. The boy's strength was nothing against his. The rifle came free, with barely a struggle. Brill checked the chamber. Empty. Of course. Kasi was a hunter. He wouldn't leave a loaded gun with a child, no matter how well he had trained him. He worked the bolt, the click-clack of the metal parts loud in the morning stillness. The rifle felt good in his hands. Solid. Real. He turned and looked at Kasi. The poacher's face was a mask of utter despair. He had lost his rifle. He had lost his power. He had endangered his son. A new deal, Brill said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. He leaned the rifle against his shoulder. You get us to Bafouébel. You get us to Jean-Pierre. You do exactly what I say. And your boy lives. And if I do not? Kasi whispered, his voice hoarse. Then he doesn't, Brill said simply. I'll leave you here, with your friend and his broken arm. And I'll find my own way to Bafouébel. But I'll take the rifle. And your son's life will be the price of your failure. There was no malice in his voice. It was a simple statement of fact, a business transaction. And that made it even more terrifying. Kasi stared at his son, then at Brill. The fight went out of him, replaced by a dull, aching resignation. He nodded. I will take you. Good. Brill turned to the camp. Let's get what we need. He walked back to where he had left the others. Anique and Rhodes were huddled together, their faces pale and strained. MBE was slumped on the ground, his eyes glassy with pain. We're moving, Brill said. We found our guide's camp. He led them into the clearing. Teke stared at the newcomers, his fear mixing with the boy's natural curiosity. He looked at MB's splinted arm, then at Anique, then at the old, soft-looking white man. The camp was a treasure trove. There were 2 gourds filled with fresh water, a slab of smoked bushmeat hanging from a branch, and a small pouch of salt. There was also a handful of ammunition for the rifle, which Brill pocketed immediately. He handed a gourd to Anique. Drink, he said. Both of you. Slowly. They drank like dying men, the cool water a benediction on their parched throats. Even MBE, roused by the promise of water, drank greedily. Brill took the smoked meat and cut off a piece with his knife. It was tough as leather and tasted of wood smoke and salt, but it was protein. It was fuel. He ate a piece, then gave the rest to Anique. Divide it, he said. The problem was MBE. He was a weight, a liability. He could barely walk, and his groans were a constant beacon in the jungle. Taking him to Bafouébel was impossible. Leaving him here was a death sentence. Brill walked over to him. MBE looked up, his eyes pleading. I can't take you with me, Brill said, his voice quiet but firm. Please, MBE begged. Don't leave me. The animals. Your friend Kasi will leave you some water and meat, Brill said. Enough for a day. Maybe 2. Bafouébel is a day's walk from here. The path is easy to follow now. If you are strong enough, you can make it. It was a lie, and they all knew it. MBE wasn't strong enough to walk 100 yards, let alone a full day's journey through the jungle. That is murder, Anik said, her voice shaking with outrage. Brill turned to her. No, he said, his voice cutting through her anger. This is survival. I have 2 people to get out of this jungle. You and him. He nodded at Rhodes. My mission is not to save everyone. It's to complete my contract. He is not part of the contract. He turned to Kasi. Give him what he needs. Kasi, his face a grim mask, did as he was told. He filled a smaller gourd with water and cut off a generous piece of the meat. He placed them on the ground next to his former partner. He couldn't bring himself to look MBE in the eye. Let's go, Brill said. He slung the rifle over his shoulder. He looked at Kasi, then at the boy, Teke. He walks with me, Brill said, nodding at the boy. You walk in front. Remember the deal. Kasi nodded, his eyes hollow. They left the camp, a new, even more miserable procession than before. Kasi in the lead, Brill right behind him, with Teke walking beside him. The boy's hand was a small trembling thing in Brill's grasp. Anik and Rhodes followed, their faces a mixture of fear and disgust. No one looked back at MBE, a lone, broken figure left to the mercy of the jungle. They walked away from the dying fire, leaving one man to his fate as they went to meet their own. The weight of the rifle on Brill's shoulder, a heavy, constant reminder of the price of every step they took. Chapter 23. Do not look at their faces. Kasi's voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the growing noise. Look at the mud. Look at your feet. Here, you are not a man. You are meat. And meat does not make eye contact. Brill felt the small, trembling hand in his own. Teke. The boy was his anchor, his leverage. He gave the hand a slight squeeze, a silent reminder of the bargain. They stood at the edge of the jungle, where the suffocating green gave way to a festering brown sore of a town. Bafwable wasn't built so much as it had congealed on the banks of the wide, sluggish river. A chaotic jumble of rust-sheeted shacks, canvas and pole shelters, and a few pockmarked concrete buildings, huddled together as if for protection. The air was thick with the smells of charcoal smoke, human waste, rotting fish, and the sweet cloying scent of cheap palm wine. The noise was a physical thing, a constant churning wave of shouts in a dozen languages, the whine of a 2-stroke engine, the rhythmic clang of a hammer on metal, and the high, frantic beat of a drum coming from somewhere deep within the maze of alleys. This was the end of the line, the place where laws were forgotten, and survival was the only currency. Where is he? Brill asked, his voice low. Jean-Pierre. Kasi laughed, a short, bitter sound. He is everywhere. He is the mud and the rot and the river. But his office, his business, is the dock. He pointed with his chin toward the riverbank, where a series of rickety wooden piers stretched out into the brown water. The big warehouse with the tin roof. That is his. We need a place to stay, Brill said. Out of sight. There are no places out of sight in Bafwable, Kasi said. Every wall has ears. Every shadow has eyes. Find one, Brill said, his voice flat. He pulled Teke a little closer. Kasi's jaw tightened. He looked at his son, then at the town. He nodded. There is a place. The old fish market. It was flooded last season. No one goes there. The smell. Lead the way, Brill said. They moved into the town. It was like stepping into a different kind of jungle, one made of men instead of trees. The main thoroughfare was a river of mud, churned by the wheels of battered trucks and the bare feet of the crowd. Men with hard, empty eyes watched them pass. Their gazes lingered on Anik, then on Rhodes, then settled on Brill. They were sizing him up, weighing his worth, calculating how much trouble it would be to kill him for his boots. The rifle on Brill's shoulder was a deterrent, but only just. Everyone here had a weapon. Machetes, pistols tucked into waistbands, ancient AK-47s held together with tape. A gun didn't make you special. It just meant you were part of the game. Cassie kept his head down, navigating the labyrinth of alleys with the instinct of a rat in its warren. He led them away from the main track, into a maze of backways that stank of filth and despair. Rhodes stumbled, his face a pasty greenish-white. I can't. Anik grabbed his arm, her face grim. You can, she said, her voice a fierce whisper. You will. She was holding on by a thread, but her thread was made of steel. They reached the old fish market. It was a long, low building with a collapsed roof, situated right on the riverbank. The stench was overwhelming, a physical assault. The ground was a slick black ooze, and the air was thick with clouds of fat, buzzing flies. Here, Cassie said, gesturing to the ruined structure. Inside, Brill commanded. They ducked through a gaping hole in the wall. The interior was dark and cavernous. Old wooden stalls, slick with years of fish guts, stood like rotting teeth. The floor was inches deep in stagnant, foul-smelling water. But from a broken window in the far wall, Brill could see the docks. He could see the big warehouse with the tin roof. It was about 200 yards away. A perfect vantage point. We stay here, Brill said. He turned to Cassie. You and the boy are with me. They, he nodded to Anik and Rhodes, will find a dry corner and they will not make a sound. He led Cassie and Teke to the broken window. He took out his binoculars. The world snapped into sharp focus. The docks were a hive of activity. Men were loading and unloading crates from a long, rusty river barge. The crates were unmarked, but they were heavy. Guns, ammunition, Brill thought. The lifeblood of this place. He scanned the warehouse. Armed guards stood at the doors, their posture relaxed but their eyes constantly moving. They were professionals. Which one is Jean-Pierre? Brill asked. Cassie peered toward the warehouse. I do not see him. But his lieutenant, the big one with the red beret. That is Etienne. Where you find Etienne, Jean-Pierre is never far. Brill found him. A mountain of a man, built like a barrel, with a bright red beret perched on his head. He was directing the work crew, shouting orders, his voice a low bark that carried even at this distance. They watched for an hour. The work was efficient, disciplined. This wasn't just a smuggling operation. It was a military one. Then a new boat arrived. Not a barge, but a sleek, powerful speedboat that cut through the brown water like a knife. It pulled up to a private pier, next to a smaller, more solid-looking building beside the main warehouse. Two men got out. One was Etienne. The other was a white man. He was tall and thin, dressed in immaculate white linen trousers and a pale blue shirt. He had short silver hair and wore dark sunglasses. Even from 200 yards away, he moved with an aura of absolute, untouchable authority. He stepped onto the pier and lit a cigarette, the small gesture full of a lazy, predatory grace. That is him, Cassie breathed, his voice tight with fear. That is Jean-Pierre. Brill kept the binoculars steady, studying the man. He wasn't what he had expected. He wasn't a wild-eyed warlord. He looked like a European banker on holiday. A banker who dealt in death instead of dollars. Jean-Pierre spoke to Etienne for a moment, then walked into the smaller building. His office. What now? Cassie asked. Brill didn't answer. He lowered the binoculars and looked at the rifle in his hands. It was a simple, brutal tool. Effective at a distance. But this wasn't a job for a rifle. Not yet. This was a job for a ghost. He needed to get closer. He needed to understand the layout, the routines, the weaknesses. He needed to know what Jean-Pierre valued. A man like that always had something he couldn't afford to lose. We wait, Brill said. We watch. He turned to Cassie. I need to know what he's selling. What he's buying. who his enemies are. Everyone is his enemy, Cassie said. And he sells to everyone. Then find me someone who wants him dead more than they fear him, Brill said. Every king has a man who wants his throne. He settled back into the shadows of the ruined market, the stench of decay a familiar cloak. He chambered around into the rifle, the sound a small, precise click in the gloom. Then he raised the weapon, not to fire but to look. He settled the crosshairs of the scope on the window of the smaller building, the office where Jean-Pierre conducted his business, waiting for a glimpse of the man who held their lives in his hands. Chapter 24. He said yes. Cassie stood dripping in the doorway of the ruined fish market, his face the color of old ash. Rain sluiced off him in sheets, turning the black mud at his feet into a soupy mess. He laughed. He said to tell the ghost he would be at the La Requin Perret show at midday. The lazy shark. Then he said after he kills you, he will bring me your head in a bucket. Did he say to come alone? Brill asked. He didn't look up from the rifle he was cleaning, with a strip of cloth torn from Rhodes's shirt. He said to bring whoever I wanted. He said to bring an army. It would not matter. Cassie shuddered, hugging himself. This is a trap. It is a game to him. Everything's a game to a man who's winning, Brill said. He worked the bolt on the rifle, the sound a clean, metallic snap. Let's see if he likes the game when the rules change. He stood up and looked at the others. Anique and Rhodes were huddled in the driest corner they could find, their faces etched with a deep, weary fear. The boy Teke sat near them, his eyes wide and fixed on Brill. Brill walked over to Cassie. You did good, he said, his voice quiet. He handed the poacher a small piece of the smoked meat. It was their last piece. Eat. Cassie took it, his hand trembling. He didn't understand this man, who could threaten his son's life one moment and offer him food the next. The rest of you, Brill said, his voice loud enough for them all to hear. You stay here. You don't move, you don't make a sound. If I'm not back by sunset, you're on your own. Anique started to say something, but the look in Brill's eyes stopped her. It wasn't cruel. It was final. Brill slung the rifle over his shoulder, the strap digging into his skin. He looked at Cassie. Show me where it is. The lazy shark was less a bar and more a collection of rotting timbers and rust-eaten corrugated sheets leaning against a pockmarked concrete wall. It faced a filthy back alley, away from the main riverfront, and smelled of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and despair. The rain had turned the alley into a shallow, muddy canal. Brill didn't go in the front. He had Cassie lead him around the back, through a gap in a fence woven from scrap metal and razor wire. He found a spot in the shadows of an adjacent building, a narrow space between a rain barrel and a pile of stinking refuse that gave him a clear view of the bar's rear entrance and its single grimy window. He settled in to wait, the rain a constant cool curtain. At 10 past noon, Etienne arrived. He didn't use the alley. He came in the front, swaggering, flanked by two of his men armed with stubby machine pistols. Through the grimy window, Brill saw Etienne dismiss them. They took up positions outside the front door, trying to look casual, their eyes scanning the street. Etienne was broadcasting his confidence. I am so dangerous, I do not need my guards. Brill waited another 5 minutes. Let him sit. Let him get impatient. Then he walked out of the shadows, crossed the alley, and went in the back door. The inside of the bar was dark and close. A few men sat at rickety tables, nursing glasses of cloudy palm wine. They looked up as Brill entered, their eyes dull and incurious. They had seen everything, and nothing surprised them. Etienne was at a table in the corner, his back to the wall. The red beret was a splash of defiant color in the gloom. A bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses sat on the table in front of him. Brill walked over and sat down without being invited. He placed the rifle on the table between them, the muzzle pointed at the floor. Etienne smiled, a slow, predatory stretching of his lips. "The ghost," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You are either very brave or very stupid to ask for this meeting." "I'm a businessman," Brill said. "I'm here to make you an offer." Etienne laughed, a deep booming sound that made the other patrons look away. He poured a generous measure of whiskey into both glasses. "I have a better offer. You tell me what you know about Okoro's men. You tell me where they are. In return, I will kill you quickly." "That's a bad offer," Brill said. He ignored the whiskey. "Okoro's bounty is $1 million, isn't it?" Etienne's smile faltered for a second. "You are well informed." "I know the price on my head," Brill said. "I also know that when Okoro's private army gets here, they won't just be looking for me. They will be looking for anyone who helped me, anyone who saw me. They will tear this town apart. They will burn your warehouses. They will sink your boats. It will be very bad for your business." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "And Jean-Pierre will blame you. Because you are in charge of security. It is your failure. He is the king, but you are the man who let the wolves into the castle." Etienne's eyes narrowed. He picked up his glass and drank, his gaze never leaving Brill's face. "You talk a great deal for a dead man." "I'm not dead yet," Brill said. "And I'm offering you a way to get richer, and to solve your problem at the same time." "I am listening." "The problem is the ghost," Brill said. "As long as I am alive, Okoro will hunt me. And he will hunt you. So the ghost has to die." He tapped the table. "Right here. In Bafwable." Etienne frowned. "You want me to kill you?" "I want you to help me disappear," Brill corrected him. "We stage my death. A body that looks like me. A firefight. Witnesses. You produce a corpse, something Okoro's men can identify. Maybe you burn it a little, to be sure. You collect the $1 million bounty. And the ghost is gone." Etienne was silent for a long moment, the gears turning behind his eyes. "A clever plan," he admitted. "But what is in it for me? $1 million is much money. But Jean-Pierre pays me well." "Jean-Pierre pays you a salary," Brill said. "I'm offering you a partnership. You get half the bounty. $500,000. Wire to any account you want. No questions asked." Etienne laughed again, but this time it was forced. "You have $500,000. The people I work for have unlimited funds," Brill said, letting a hint of annoyance color his voice. "This is a small price to keep their operations quiet." "And what else?" Etienne asked, his greed warring with his suspicion. "This is not all you are offering." "No," Brill said. "This is the down payment." He leaned in closer, his voice a conspirator's whisper. "The real prize is a weapons cache. A full shipping container. Misplaced during the last civil war. Belgian FNCs, brand new. Mortars. RPGs. Enough to start an army. Or to make a man the undisputed king of this river." He saw the flicker in Etienne's eyes. The raw, naked ambition. "Where is this cache?" "Buried in a cave system about 50 kilometers north of here," Brill said, inventing the details on the fly. "The location is known to only 2 men. Me. And the man I killed to get the information." He sat back, letting the offer hang in the air between them. The promise of money. The promise of power. The two things a man like Etienne understood. "Jean-Pierre is a good boss," Etienne said, as if trying to convince himself. "He is a good boss now," Brill said. "But he is old. He is comfortable. His fight is over." Yours is just beginning. When Okoro's men burn this place down, will he reward your loyalty? Or will he cut you loose to save himself? A king always sacrifices his knights. He stood up, picking up the rifle. Think about it, Etienne. A dead ghost. $500,000. And an arsenal that would make you more powerful than Jean-Pierre, more powerful than Okoro himself. He started for the back door. Wait, Etienne said. Brill stopped but didn't turn around. How do I know this is not a trick? Etienne asked. You don't, Brill said. But you're a betting man. You can bet on Jean-Pierre's fading loyalty. Or you can bet on yourself. He paused. I'll need a boat. Down river. All the way to the coast. And passage for 3 others. You arrange that. You help me fake my death. And the location of the cash is yours. He walked out the back door without looking back, leaving Etienne alone in the dark, smoky bar with the bottle of whiskey and a choice that could make him a king or get him killed. Chapter 25. The body smells. Etienne stood over the corpse, a lit cigarette dangling from his lips. He wrinkled his nose. The man had been a drifter, one of the nameless, faceless men who washed up in Bafoué to die. He'd been dead for 2 days, pulled from the river that morning. He was the right height, the right build. And now he was wearing Brill's torn, filthy clothes. A fire will fix the smell, Brill said. He stood in the shadows of the abandoned fishing hut, watching. And it will make him harder to identify. Just enough. You have thought of everything, Etienne said, a grudging respect in his voice. He looked around the small, muddy clearing on the riverbank, 3 kilometers downriver from the town. It was the perfect stage. Isolated, but not too isolated. Close enough for the sound of gunfire to travel. It's my job, Brill said. Is everything in place? My men are in the trees, Etienne said, gesturing with his cigarette. They know their parts. The witnesses. A few fishermen I paid to be in the right place at the right time. They will see a gunfight. They will see a white man fall. They will see my men cheer. And the boat. Waiting for you. Another kilometer downriver. The pilot has been paid. He will take you to the coast. He asks no questions. Etienne took a final drag from his cigarette and flicked it into the mud. The money. The account number for my employers has been sent to your man in town, Brill said. Once I am on that boat and clear of this river, they will transfer $500,000 to your account. The other half goes to them for arranging my new life. Etienne nodded. He didn't like it, not having the full million, but $500,000 and a dead ghost was a good night's work. And the guns. The cash. Brill pulled a small, waterproof packet from his pocket and tossed it to Etienne. The map is in there. Coordinates. Directions. Everything you need to become king. Etienne caught it, his eyes alight with a feverish greed. He didn't open it. Not yet. First, the performance. It is time, Etienne said. He pulled a heavy pistol from his belt. When you hear the first shot, you have 5 minutes to be gone. My men will provide the noise. Brill nodded. He faded back into the trees, where the others were waiting. Anique clutched Rhodes's arm, her knuckles white. Cassie held his son Teke close, shielding the boy's eyes. They had been silent for hours, passengers in a play they did not understand. We're moving, Brill said in a low voice. Stay behind me. Don't make a sound. He led them through the dense, dripping jungle, following a barely their path that ran parallel to the river. The air was thick and humid, alive with the buzz of insects. Then the first shot cracked through the night. It was followed by a ragged burst of automatic fire. Shouts echoed across the water. The sound of a man screaming. The play had begun. Brill picked up the pace, his feet sure on the muddy ground. He could hear the firefight behind them, a chaotic symphony of gunfire. Etienne was putting on a good show. Loud, violent, convincing. He risked a glance back. Through the trees, he could see flashes of light from the muzzles of the rifles. It looked real. It sounded real. Teke whimpered, and Kasi tightened his grip on the boy, whispering to him in their own language. Anik stumbled, and Rhodes caught her, his face a grim, determined mask. They were alive. They were moving. That was all that mattered. They reached the spot Etienne had described. A small, hidden cove where a long, narrow boat was tied to a mangrove root. A man sat at the tiller, his face hidden in shadow. He didn't look up as they approached. "Get in," Brill said, his voice urgent. Kasi pushed his son into the boat first, then scrambled in after him. Anik and Rhodes followed, collapsing onto the rough wooden planks. Brill was the last one in. He turned to Kasi. "This is where we part ways," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick roll of bills, the cash he had taken from the missionaries. He pressed it into Kasi's hand. "For you and the boy. Find a new place. A better one." Kasi stared at the money, then at Brill, his eyes wide with a confusion that went beyond fear. "Why?" "You kept your end of the bargain," Brill said. It was the only explanation he could offer. He gave the pilot a sharp nod. The engine sputtered to life, a low, throbbing growl. The boat pulled away from the shore, sliding into the black, silent current of the river. In the distance, the gunfire was starting to die down. A final, triumphant shout echoed across the water. Brill watched the dark shoreline recede. He was on a boat, heading for a coast he didn't know, with a new name and a new face waiting for him. The ghost was dead, burned in a fishing hut on the edge of a forgotten river. He had no gun, no mission, no identity. He was free. The boat picked up speed, the prow cutting through the dark water, leaving the jungle and its ghosts behind. Brill leaned back against the rough wood, the cool night air on his face. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know what came next. For the first time in a very long time, he was simply a man on a boat, disappearing into the night. Don't miss a single action-packed declassified Shadwa Boxer file. Declassified Files Box Set. Deep Dive. Deception Tide. Miami Mirage. Cuban Crossfire. Devil's Rope. Quick Response. Weapons Grade. Canvas Code. Weapons Free. Panama Proxy. Deep State. Off the Hook. Loose Ends. Border Wars. Course of Action. Depth Charge. Summit. Redacted. Target Rich. The Shadowboxer Files. Asset. Render. Operative. Sideways. Choke Point. Decreed. In the Dark. True Nature. Nominee. False Flag. Burn Bag. Credible Threat. Tin Trooper. Deadly Scoop. Silent Trigger. Hunted. Under the Radar. The Shadowboxer Files Massive Box Set.